I have $2. Is that enough for bread? Annie's voice was small, almost swallowed by the hum of the refrigerators and the hiss of the espresso machine behind the counter. She stood on her toes to see over the glass display, her fingers barely reaching the edge. The bakery was crowded for a Thursday evening. Office workers in wool coats, a retired couple sharing a cinnamon roll, a delivery driver warming his hands around a paper cup of coffee. Outside, February wind scraped along the sidewalks of Chicago's South Side, pushing cold through the cracks of old brick buildings. Annie swallowed and tried again. I have $2, she repeated, her voice trembling now. Is that enough for bread? The cashier didn't look up this time. She was in her late 40s, her hair pinned tightly back, glasses sliding down her nose as she rang up a box of pastries for the customer ahead. She heard Annie. Everyone heard Annie, but she kept scanning barcodes as if the question belonged to the hum of the machines. Annie slowly opened her palm. 2 crumpled dollar bills, 3 quarters, a few nickels and pennies. She poured the coins onto the counter. They clinked softly, fragile and insufficient. Behind her, a little girl tugged at the back of her coat. Annie, the child whispered. I'm hungry. Annie turned and gave her a thin smile. It's okay, Lila. We're getting bread. Lila couldn't have been more than 5. Her cheeks were hollow in that way children's faces should never be. She wore Annie's old knit hat pulled too far down over her ears. One mitten was missing. The cashier finally glanced at the pile of coins. That's not enough, she said flatly. For the small one? Annie asked quickly. Just the small loaf? It's $3.10. Annie nodded as if doing math in her head could change the answer. I can put some back, she said. We don't need the whole thing. The cashier sighed, already reaching for the next customer's order. Honey, I've got a line. And just like that, Annie became invisible. She stood there a second longer, her small shoulders stiffening. The coins remained on the counter, unclaimed, as though they didn't belong to anyone. Across the bakery, Daniel Whitmore froze. He had entered quietly. No announcement, no entourage. At 40 years old, Daniel had already built Whitmore Freight Systems into a national logistics powerhouse. The business journals called him disciplined, focused, ruthless when necessary. He preferred the word careful. He had grown up on the west side of Detroit in the early 80s, in a neighborhood that no longer existed except in memory. He knew the smell of cheap soup and empty cupboards. He knew what it felt like to count coins under a dim kitchen light while pretending not to notice his mother skipping dinner. He had not expected to remember it today. But when Annie said, I have $2, is that enough for bread? Something inside him shifted. The memory rose fast and sharp. He was 12 again, standing in a diner with cracked vinyl booths, snow melting off his boots, $1.80 in his pocket. The waitress looking at him with polite impatience. That's not enough for soup, she had said. He remembered the way the men at the counter had stared, the way he had nodded and walked out, pretending he wasn't hungry. He remembered the humiliation more than the hunger. Daniel inhaled slowly. Back in the present, Annie gathered the coins into a smaller pile, pushing them toward the cashier again. Please, she said. My sister's hungry. The cashieress avoided her eyes. I told you, sweetheart, it's not enough. Lila tugged Annie's sleeve again. Annie. Daniel felt the cold of that old diner seep into his bones. He had spent 25 years building walls between himself and that boy. He told himself that success required distance, that compassion, unmanaged, could sink a company faster than bad investments. But the sound of coins on glass had a way of breaking walls. He stepped forward. The line parted instinctively. His coat was tailored charcoal, his presence quiet but unmistakable. People recognized authority even when it wasn't announced. He stopped beside Annie. How much more does she need? He asked calmly. The cashier blinked, startled, finally looking fully at the scene. She recognized him instantly. Mr. Whitmore, she said, her tone changing. It's just, how much? He repeated. $1.10. Daniel looked down at Annie. Up close, he could see the careful bravery in her eyes. Not begging, not demanding, just asking. He crouched slightly so he wasn't towering over her. What's your name? Annie, she whispered. And your sister? Lila. He glanced at Lila, who was staring at the bread behind the glass as though it were something sacred. Daniel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his wallet, but he paused. "Why are you shopping alone?" he asked gently. Annie hesitated. "Mom's tired," she said. "She's working nights." Daniel knew that answer. It meant exhausted. It meant doing everything possible and still coming up short. He placed a $20 bill on the counter. "Bread," he said, "and soup, and whatever else they need." The cashier moved quickly now, almost too quickly. The small loaf, 2 cans of chicken noodle, a jar of peanut butter, a half-gallon of milk, the bag filled. Annie's eyes widened. "Sir, that's too much." "It's enough," Daniel said quietly. Lila smiled for the first time. Behind them, someone murmured approval. An older man near the window nodded once, as if witnessing something he understood deeply. Daniel handed Annie the bag. She still held her $2 in her hand. "You keep that," he told her. She shook her head. "It's for food." He studied her for a long moment. "I know," he said softly. "And you came here with honesty. That matters." Outside, the wind rattled the bakery windows. Daniel straightened. He had come into this neighborhood to evaluate property values and expansion plans, numbers, projections, risk assessments. Instead, he had been handed $2 and a memory he had buried for 28 years. As Annie guided her sister toward the door, Daniel found himself speaking before logic could stop him. "I'll walk you home," he said. Annie looked up at him, uncertain. "It's cold," he added. She nodded slowly. The bell above the bakery door chimed as they stepped outside into the biting Chicago wind. Daniel pulled his coat tighter around himself. For years, he had believed hunger was something you outgrew once you built enough wealth. Standing beside 2 small girls clutching a paper bag of bread, he understood something different. Hunger leaves, but the memory of being turned away never does. And this time, he had not walked out. Daniel unlocked the black SUV with a soft electronic click. The headlights blinked once against the darkening Chicago street. Annie hesitated at the curb. She was only 6 small enough that the paper bag of bread seemed almost as big as her torso. Lila stood beside her, thumb pressed quietly against her lip now that the cold had settled deeper into the evening. "It's okay," Daniel said gently. "It's warm inside." He opened the rear passenger door himself. The interior smelled faintly of leather and cedar. Heat rolled out in a soft wave, carrying away the bite of February wind. Annie glanced at the vehicle's polished interior, then at Daniel, then back at the building behind her. She was measuring risk. Children in neighborhoods like this learn to do that early. "You don't have to," Daniel added, keeping his tone even. "I just thought I'd make sure you get home safely." Annie nodded once and climbed in, helping Lila up beside her. She placed the bread carefully on her lap, as if afraid it might disappear. Daniel closed the door quietly and walked around to the driver's side. As he started the engine, the dashboard lights glowed softly, casting a calm blue across the interior. For a moment, none of them spoke. Through the rearview mirror, he saw Annie studying everything: the stitched leather seats, the digital screen, the quiet hum of a machine built for comfort. "You drive this every day?" she asked. "Yes." She considered that. "It's big." "Ah," Daniel almost smiled. "It is." He eased the SUV away from the curb. Outside, streetlights painted long shadows across cracked sidewalks. A bus passed them in the opposite direction, windows glowing with tired commuters. "Where do you live?" Daniel asked. "Madison Street," Annie said, "near the corner store." He nodded. As they drove, Lila leaned her head against Annie's shoulder. "I'm still hungry," she whispered. Annie tightened her arm around her sister. "We'll eat soon." Daniel heard it, the quiet promise in her voice, a promise far heavier than a 6-year-old should carry. At the next red light, he glanced again in the mirror. "You ever had chocolate cake fresh out of the oven?" he asked casually. Annie frowned slightly. "Like birthday cake?" "Better," he said. "My daughter's baking tonight. She insists on testing recipes." Annie's eyes flickered with curiosity despite herself. "You have a daughter?" "Yes. Her name is Claire. She's 8. Lila looked up. "Does she get cake whenever she wants?" Daniel exhaled softly. "Not whenever she wants, but more often than she needs." The light turned green. He drove a little slower than necessary. The thought had arrived suddenly, almost without permission. He had not planned on altering the evening. He had a conference call scheduled in an hour, a financial report waiting, emails stacking up like bricks in a wall he had built around himself. Yet the image of Annie pouring coins onto a bakery counter would not leave him. He cleared his throat. "Would you like to come by my house for a little while?" he asked gently. "Have some cake before I take you home." Silence. Annie stiffened. "We can't," she said quickly. "Mom says don't go places." "That's wise," Daniel replied calmly. "You're right to listen." He slowed the vehicle as they approached the corner she had mentioned. "I wouldn't take you anywhere without calling her first," he added. "You can speak to her. She can say no." Annie watched him carefully. "Why?" she asked. It wasn't suspicion in her tone. It was confusion. Daniel considered the question. "Because once, no one invited me in," he thought. Aloud, he said, "Because sometimes it helps to know there are other tables in the world." They reached Madison Street. Annie pointed. "That building." Daniel pulled to the curb but kept the engine running. He turned in his seat slightly so he could face them without looming. "You don't have to decide now," he said. "I just thought, maybe your sister shouldn't go to bed hungry tonight." Lila's eyes widened at the word cake. Annie looked at the paper bag on her lap. "We have bread," she said softly, as if defending her effort. "Yes," Daniel agreed, "and that matters." For a long moment, the only sound was the low hum of the engine. Then Annie surprised him. "Can we bring some home for Mom?" she asked. The question struck him harder than anything else had. "Yes," he said immediately. "Of course. If this moment touched your heart, take a second to let us know. Like this video, share your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. And if you believe in quiet acts of kindness and stories that remind us what truly matters, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one." Annie nodded once. "Then, we can come. But just for a little." Daniel smiled. Not broadly, not triumphantly, just enough to soften his features. "That's fair." He pulled away from the curb. As the SUV turned toward the lakefront, the neighborhood slowly shifted. Brick gave way to stone. Streetlights grew brighter. Storefronts looked cleaner. The road smoothed. Annie noticed everything. "Do you live far from here?" she asked. "About 15 minutes, he replied. "That's far," Lila said sleepily. Daniel glanced again in the mirror. He felt something unfamiliar rising inside him, not pity, not obligation, recognition. He remembered being 6, walking home in Detroit with his younger cousin, promising him dinner would taste better tomorrow. Remembering the way wealth seemed like a different country, visible, but unreachable. He had crossed that border long ago. Tonight, he wondered what it meant to cross back. They turned into a quiet, tree-lined street. Large homes stood behind wrought iron gates. Windows glowed warmly against the night. Annie's fingers tightened around the bread. "You live here?" she asked. "Yes." He pulled into a driveway lined with bare winter trees. The house was large but not ostentatious. Stone facade, wide porch, lights glowing from the kitchen windows. Daniel turned off the engine. For a moment, none of them moved. Inside the house, through the window, a small figure darted past, carrying something that looked suspiciously like a mixing bowl. Daniel felt his chest tighten, not with anxiety, but with awareness. Two worlds were about to meet. He stepped out of the SUV and opened the rear door. Warm light spilled across the driveway. "You don't have to stay long," he reminded Annie gently. She nodded, but as she stepped onto the smooth stone walkway, holding her sister's hand, her eyes lifted toward the glowing windows with something new, not hunger, wonder. The front door opened before Daniel could reach for the handle. "Dad?" Claire's voice carried across the porch, bright and curious. "You're home early." She stood barefoot on the hardwood just inside the doorway. Flour dusted across the front of her pink sweater. Her dark curls were tied back in a loose ponytail, and she held a wooden spoon like a baton. Then she saw Annie and Lila. Claire froze, but not in fear, in surprise. Daniel felt the moment stretch thin. "Yes," he said calmly. "I am. And we have guests." The word guests mattered. Annie stood very still on the porch. The house behind Daniel was larger than any place she had ever entered. Warm light poured from the hallway. Somewhere deeper inside, an oven timer chimed softly. Lila clutched Annie's hand and stared at the doorway as though it were the entrance to another world. Claire recovered first. "Hi," she said, stepping aside instinctively. "Do you like chocolate?" Annie blinked. Yes. Claire grinned. Good, because I might have made too much. Daniel exhaled slowly. Children, he thought, still knew how to cross borders adults built. Claire, he said gently. This is Annie. And this is Lila. Claire wiped her flour-covered hands on a kitchen towel and stepped forward. Hi, Annie. Hi, Lila. Lila hid halfway behind Annie's coat but peeked out shyly. Annie nodded. Hi. Daniel gestured toward the foyer. Come in. It's cold. They stepped inside carefully, as though afraid the polished floor might reject them. Annie immediately bent to untie her worn sneakers. You don't have to, Daniel said. My mom says always take shoes off, Annie replied. Daniel nodded once. Your mom raised you right. He noticed Annie relax a fraction at that. The house smelled like sugar and butter. A soft jazz record played from the living room, something old, something warm. The fireplace glowed low. Claire led them toward the kitchen. The island counter was covered in mixing bowls and measuring cups. A cooling rack held a round chocolate cake, its surface glossy with fresh frosting. Lila's eyes widened. That's for you? She whispered. Claire shrugged. Dad says I can only keep half. Daniel leaned against the counter, watching the three girls in a quiet triangle of light. He had built this kitchen after Claire was born. Open space, wide counters, a place meant for laughter and Sunday mornings. He suddenly saw it differently through Annie's eyes. Annie stood rigid at first, scanning everything. The stainless steel appliances, the bowl of fresh fruit, the framed school photos on the wall. You live here all the time? She asked Claire. Claire giggled. Yeah. Where else would I live? Annie didn't answer. Daniel stepped forward and cut 3 generous slices of cake. He placed them on white plates and handed one to Annie, one to Lila, one to Claire. Lila didn't wait. She took a bite so big frosting smeared across her cheek. Claire laughed and handed her a napkin. Annie held her fork carefully. She took one small bite. Her eyes closed. Daniel recognized that look, not just enjoyment, relief. You can eat more, Claire encouraged. Annie shook her head slightly. We're bringing some home. Daniel had already anticipated that. He reached for a small cake box from the pantry. There will be plenty, he said quietly. For a few minutes, the kitchen felt normal. The kind of normal Daniel had always believed could not coexist with the world outside his gates. Claire told a story about a spelling test. Lila listened with open fascination. Annie watched Claire the way children watch possibilities. Then Annie asked a question that shifted the room. Do you ever worry about money? She asked Claire. Claire blinked. Money? For food. Annie clarified. Claire frowned, thinking hard. No, I don't think so. Daniel felt the weight of that exchange settle between the counters and the cabinets. Annie nodded slowly, as if confirming something she had suspected. Daniel spoke carefully. Claire doesn't worry about food, he said. Because that's my job. Annie looked at him. And who worries about yours? She asked. The question landed like a quiet bell. For a moment, Daniel had no answer. He had spent years convincing himself that success erased certain memories, that building enough wealth built enough distance. Yet here stood a 6-year-old who understood responsibility in ways quarterly reports never could. Claire, oblivious to the undercurrent, pushed the cake box toward Annie. You can take this home, she said brightly. I can make more. Lila smiled with chocolate still on her cheek. Daniel crouched slightly so he was eye level with Annie. Your mom knows you're here? He asked gently. Annie hesitated. She thinks we're getting bread. Daniel nodded slowly. Then we won't stay long. He rose and walked to the window. Outside, beyond the iron gates, the street was quiet. But he felt something shifting inside himself. He had invited them in because of memory, because of hunger. But as he watched Annie carefully wrap leftover cake for her mother before taking another bite for herself, he realized something deeper. This wasn't charity. This was recognition. 2 girls who had learned too early how fragile security could be, and a man who once stood where they stood. Only he had walked away alone. Claire tugged at Annie's sleeve. Want to see my room? Annie glanced at Daniel instinctively. He nodded. They disappeared down the hallway, their footsteps light against hardwood. Daniel remained in the kitchen with Lila, who was licking frosting from her fork. Good? He asked. She nodded enthusiastically. Yes. Daniel smiled faintly. Through the hallway, he could hear Claire's voice, excited, welcoming. two worlds overlapping for the first time. Daniel stood still, listening, and somewhere deep inside, beneath the success, beneath the discipline, beneath the carefully constructed armor of a self-made man, a door he had closed at 12 years old began, slowly, to open. Claire's bedroom door remained half open, light spilling into the hallway like a quiet invitation. Daniel stood near the base of the staircase, listening to the soft murmur of children's voices, Claire explaining something about a school project, Annie responding politely, carefully. Lila sat at the kitchen island now, swinging her legs against the cabinet doors, finishing the last of her cake. Chocolate frosting clung to the corner of her mouth. Daniel handed her a glass of milk. Slowly, he said gently. She obeyed. He checked the time on his watch. His conference call had come and gone. His assistant had likely left 2 voicemails by now. The board would not understand this detour. For the first time in years, that thought did not bother him. Upstairs, Claire laughed. The sound carried through the house pure, unguarded. Daniel walked to the window overlooking the driveway. Beyond the wrought iron gate, the street lay quiet under street lamps. A thin layer of frost shimmered against parked cars. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. Unknown number. He let it ring. Then it rang again immediately. He answered, "Yes." A male voice responded, calm but edged. "Mr. Whitmore." "This is Officer Caleb Grant." Daniel's expression did not change. "Yes, officer. I understand you were seen leaving Whitman's bakery with 2 minors." Daniel's gaze shifted toward the hallway where the girls' voices drifted. "I walked them home," he replied evenly. "Did you?" Grant asked. "That's interesting, because I just drove past Madison Street. They weren't there." Daniel felt a slow tightening in his chest. "They're with me," he said. A brief pause. "With you?" Grant repeated. "Without parental consent?" Daniel's tone cooled. "I spoke with their mother." There was another pause, longer this time. "I'd like to verify that," Grant said. "Then verify it," Daniel replied. "You mind if I stop by?" Daniel stepped away from the window. "My address is not public record for casual visits," he said calmly. Grant chuckled softly. "In this city, everything's accessible." The line went quiet. Daniel ended the call without another word. Lila looked up at him. "Was that the police?" she asked. "Yes," Daniel answered truthfully. Her small fingers tightened around her glass. Upstairs, footsteps approached. Claire and Annie appeared at the top of the stairs. Claire held a framed photo. "We were looking at pictures," she announced. Annie descended slowly, studying the photograph in her hands. It showed Daniel years earlier, mid-30s, thinner, standing in front of his first warehouse with a handful of employees. "You built all that?" Annie asked. "Yes." "How?" The question carried no envy, only curiosity. "By working," he said. "And by not quitting when people expected me to." Annie nodded slowly, absorbing that. Before Daniel could say more, headlights swept across the living room wall. A car had pulled up outside the gate. Daniel moved to the window. A patrol cruiser idled at the curb. Claire followed his gaze. "Dad?" He turned calmly. "It's all right." A knock echoed faintly from beyond the iron gate. Not at the door. At the gate itself, measured, deliberate. Annie's face went pale. "It's him," she whispered. Daniel walked toward the foyer. He did not rush. He did not hesitate. He stepped outside onto the porch, closing the door gently behind him. The cold hit immediately. Officer Grant stood by the gate, one hand resting casually on his belt. Even from a distance, Daniel could see the faint smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Evening," Grant called. Daniel descended the steps slowly. "Officer," Grant glanced past him toward the house. "Mind opening up?" "For what purpose?" "Just checking on the welfare of 2 minors." Daniel studied him carefully. "Welfare checks require probable cause." Grant's jaw shifted slightly. "You don't think it looks strange?" he asked. "A wealthy man picking up 2 girls from a low-income block and bringing them here?" Daniel held his gaze. "I think it looks stranger when a police officer monitors who buys bread." Silence thickened between them. Grant stepped closer to the gate. "You don't know their situation," he said. "And you do?" Daniel asked quietly. Grant's eyes hardened. "I know enough." Daniel spoke evenly. "I have spoken to their mother. I have ensured their safety. If you have further concerns, you are welcome to file them through proper channels." Grant's hand tapped lightly against the gate. "You're not untouchable, Whitmore." Daniel did not flinch. "I never claimed to be." For a long moment, neither man moved. Inside the house, through the window, Claire stood beside Annie, both watching. Grant followed Daniel's glance and noticed them. His expression shifted, subtle, unreadable. "I'll be checking in," he said finally. "I'm sure you will," Daniel replied. Grant turned, walked back to his cruiser, and drove off slowly. The street returned to stillness. Daniel remained at the gate for several seconds, listening to the fading engine. Something in the officer's tone lingered, not simple concern. Intent, he walked back toward the house. When he stepped inside, Annie looked up at him immediately. "Are we in trouble?" she asked. Daniel knelt so he was eye level with her. "No," he said firmly. "You are not in trouble." Lila moved closer to Annie. Claire frowned. "Why would you be in trouble?" she asked, genuinely confused. Annie hesitated. "Sometimes," she said quietly. "We are." The room fell silent. Daniel stood slowly. He understood then that tonight was no longer just about cake. It was about something older, deeper, about who was protected and who was questioned. He looked at Annie. "You're safe here," he said. And for the first time that evening, Annie allowed herself to believe it. The house felt warmer after Daniel closed the door, but the air inside had changed. Claire stayed near the staircase, arms folded tight across her sweater, as if she could physically hold confusion in place. Lila hovered behind Annie, still clutching the paper bag with the leftover cake like it was proof the evening had really happened. Annie stood in the middle of the foyer, small shoulders squared, eyes fixed on Daniel's face. She was waiting for the next adult decision, the kind that always came without warning and never felt fair. Daniel kept his voice steady. "Let's sit in the kitchen, somewhere bright." He led them back toward the island, the same counter where cake and laughter had lived 10 minutes ago. He poured water into glasses, placed them within reach, and moved with deliberate calm, not because he felt calm, because he knew calm was contagious, especially for children. Claire slid into a stool and watched Annie like she was trying to solve a puzzle without the picture on the box. "Why did he come here?" Claire asked, her voice lower than before. "He didn't even know you." Annie's eyes dropped. Daniel answered carefully. "Some people don't need to know you to decide you're suspicious." Claire frowned. "That's not fair." Annie's mouth tightened. "It's normal." The word normal hurt more than Daniel expected. He took a slow breath and turned to Annie. "You said your mom was home. Can you call her?" Annie nodded quickly. "Yes, I can." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out an older phone-scratched screen. Cheap case, the kind of prepaid device that came with minutes you counted carefully. Her fingers hovered over the buttons, then she stopped. Her gaze flicked toward the front window, as if expecting the patrol cruiser to still be there. Daniel understood instantly. "You don't like calling from inside houses," he said softly. Annie didn't answer, but her eyes shifted, confirming without admitting. Daniel nodded once. "Okay, I'll call." He picked up his own phone from the counter. The screen lit up with missed calls and unread messages. He ignored them all. "What's her number?" he asked. Annie recited it from memory, each digit precise. Daniel dialed, stepping a few feet away so he wasn't towering over the girls. He kept his tone professional and respectful as the line rang. Once, twice, a click, a woman's voice, strained and cautious. "Hello?" Daniel softened his tone. "Ma'am, my name is Daniel Whitmore. I believe your daughter Annie just came from the bakery with her sister." Silence, sharp and immediate. Then, "Where are they?" The fear in that question wasn't loud. It was the kind that lived under the skin. "They're safe," Daniel said quickly. "They're with me. I met them at the bakery. Annie was trying to buy bread." Another silence, shorter this time. "You're the man from the news," the woman said. "Yes, and my child is in your house," she replied, voice tightening. "Why?" Daniel did not flinch from the question. He respected it. "I offered them cake and warmth for a little while," he said. "And I wanted to make sure they got home safely. I plan to drive them back to you within the hour, unless you prefer sooner." A shallow breath on the other end. "I told her not to go anywhere," the woman said, quieter now, more exhausted than angry. "I told her she was trying to feed her sister," Daniel replied gently. "She didn't ask for anything free." She asked if $2 was enough. The line went quiet. Daniel could hear faint background noise, an old radiator clicking, maybe, or a television turned low. He pictured a small apartment, dim light, a woman stretched thin. Finally, the woman spoke again. "Is Annie okay?" Daniel looked toward the kitchen. Annie was watching him like her whole body was a question. "She's okay," he said. "She's brave. And she's polite." A pause. "That's her," the woman murmured. Like it hurt to hear it, Daniel continued, steady. "An officer came to my gate just now, Caleb Grant. He said he was checking the welfare of the children." The line sharpened again. "Grant," the woman said, and it came out like a bruise being pressed. Daniel's eyes narrowed. "You know him." There was a beat too long before she answered. "Everybody knows him." Daniel kept his voice low. "Ma'am, are you safe right now?" A soft laugh, humorless. "Safe?" she repeated, as if the word didn't belong in her vocabulary. "I'm tired, Mr. Whitmore. I'm just tired." Daniel didn't push her to confess things she couldn't safely say over a phone. He knew how power worked. It didn't just silence you with threats. It silenced you by making you feel watched. So he changed the angle, kept it practical. "I'm bringing them home. I'll stay on the phone with you while we drive if you want." "No," she said quickly. "Just bring them. Don't make it worse." Daniel felt his jaw tighten. "Worse?" Another pause, then her voice dropped. "People like him don't like attention, especially not attention from people like you." Daniel heard the implication and let it sit without argument. "Your daughters will be home soon," he said, "and I'd like to arrange a doctor to see you. A real visit. Not a bill you can't pay." The woman inhaled sharply. "We can't afford." "I'm not asking you to afford it," Daniel said. "I'm asking you to accept it." Silence again. Then, quietly, "I don't know you." "I know," Daniel replied. "That's why I'm offering this the clean way. No strings." He looked back at Annie. Her eyes were wet now, but she wasn't crying. She was holding herself together because children like her learned that tears were an invitation for adults to dismiss you. Daniel finished gently. "I'll be there in 15 minutes. The woman's voice cracked just slightly. "Okay." The call ended. Daniel stood still for a moment, phone in hand, feeling the weight of what he'd heard and what she hadn't said. Behind him, Annie spoke softly. "She mad?" Daniel turned, his expression calm. "No. She's worried." Annie nodded once like that made sense. "She's always worried." Claire's brow furrowed. "Why would she be worried?" "You're bringing them home." Annie looked at Claire, then down at her own hands. "Because sometimes, bringing us home is the part that makes people angry." Daniel felt something cold settle behind his ribs. He stepped to the counter, picked up the cake box Annie had carefully packed, and set it beside the bread. "We're leaving now," he said. Leela perked up. "We're going to Mom?" "Yes," Annie said, and her voice carried relief and fear tangled together. Daniel grabbed his coat and gloves. "Claire, you're staying inside. You lock the door behind me. If anyone comes to the gate, you do not open it. You call Mrs. Ortega next door." Claire's eyes widened. "Dad, just do it," Daniel said gently, but with the firmness she recognized. Claire nodded. Annie slipped her shoes back on quickly, hands shaking slightly as she tied the laces. Lila fumbled with her one mitten. Daniel opened the door. Cold air rushed in. As they stepped onto the porch, Daniel glanced once more toward the street. The patrol cruiser was gone, but he could still feel the officer's presence like a shadow that had learned the shape of their lives. Daniel guided the girls into the SUV, then paused with his hand on the steering wheel, speaking quietly enough that only he could hear himself. Justice is supposed to be blind, he thought. Not selective. He started the engine and drove toward Madison Street with a new understanding. The hardest part wasn't paying for bread. The hardest part was what power did when you refused to look away. The drive back to Madison Street took 12 minutes. Daniel knew because he watched the clock on the dashboard, the way he watched weather forecasts before a long haul quietly, with respect. The city slid past the windows in layers, bright storefronts giving way to dim blocks, newer buildings dissolving into older brick, streetlights stretching farther apart as if even the electricity had learned to conserve itself here. Annie sat upright in the back seat, cake box pressed to her chest with both arms. Lila leaned against her shoulder, half asleep, thumb tucked into the edge of her mittenless sleeve. Annie kept glancing out the rear passenger window. Not at the scenery, but at the reflections. Tail lights, headlights, shapes that might be following. Daniel didn't ask why. He already knew. When they turned onto Madison, Annie's breathing changed small, quick, controlled. Daniel slowed the SUV as they approached the building. The dented steel door, the dim stairwell window patched with cardboard, the tired geometry of poverty that never looked accidental, always designed. He pulled to the curb and left the engine running. Annie didn't move right away. "Your mom's inside?" Daniel asked softly. Annie nodded. "She'll be waiting." He handed Annie the bag with the bread and the soup and then lifted the cake box from her arms for a second to adjust the handle, making sure it wouldn't rip. "You carry it," he said, returning it to her carefully. Annie blinked. "You don't want to?" He shook his head. "It's yours to give." That mattered. He saw it in the way her shoulders eased a fraction. They stepped out into the cold. Daniel walked on the sidewalk side, not in front, not beside, where he could block traffic if he needed to without making it feel like a performance. They reached the building entrance. That was when Annie froze. A patrol cruiser sat across the street, angled toward them, engine running, lights off. Daniel's body went still in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with preparation. The driver's door opened slowly. Officer Caleb Grant stepped out like he had all the time in the world. He crossed the street with that same smile Daniel had seen at the gate, friendly enough from a distance. Hollow up close. He didn't hurry. He didn't need to. He wanted the moment to belong to him. "Evening," Grant said, voice easy. "Funny seeing you here again, Mr. Whitmore." Daniel kept his hands visible, relaxed at his sides. "Officer." Grant's gaze dropped immediately to Annie and Lila. His smile warmed in a way that felt practiced, like a mask he could switch depending on the audience. "Hey there," he said to Annie. "Too cheerful. You girls been out late." Annie's fingers tightened around the cake box handle. The cardboard creaked. "We're going home," she whispered. Grant chuckled softly, eyes never leaving her. "That's good. That's real good." He looked back at Daniel. "So you did bring them home." Daniel's voice remained calm. As promised. Grant nodded slowly, as though noting something in an invisible file. "You know, people talk. They see a man like you with little girls like them." He let the sentence trail off and shrugged. "City's full of stories." Daniel held his gaze. "Then it's good you're here to prevent the wrong one." Grant's smile twitched but stayed in place. He stepped closer, stopping just outside Daniel's personal space. "I'm here because their mother called," Grant said lightly. "Said she didn't know where her kids were." Annie flinched. Daniel looked down at her, then back to Grant. "I spoke to their mother. She knew exactly where they were." Grant's tone stayed smooth. "Maybe she forgot to mention you." Daniel didn't take the bait. "She told me not to make things worse." Grant's eyes sharpened for half a second, then softened again. "Smart woman," Annie whispered, barely audible. "He's lying." Grant's head turned toward her like a dog hearing a sound. "What's that, sweetheart?" Annie swallowed hard. "Nothing." Daniel felt something cold settle behind his ribs. This wasn't a welfare check. This was pressure. Grant shifted his stance and glanced toward the building door. "Go on then." "Let's see, Mom." Annie's face drained of color. "She's tired." Grant's smile grew. "Then I won't take much of her time." Daniel's voice stayed level. "She doesn't need to be disturbed. The children are home." Grant looked at him as if Daniel had mistaken who owned the sidewalk. "I decide what needs to happen," Grant said softly. "That's how my job works." Daniel leaned in just a fraction. Not threatening, not dramatic. "Your job works under policy. And policy doesn't give you the right to use children as leverage." Grant's jaw flexed. He glanced around as if, suddenly aware of the street curtains twitching, a neighbor pretending to check the mail. Witnesses existed here, quiet ones, people who watched without wanting to be seen. Grant turned his attention back to Annie. His voice sweetened, syrupy. "Annie, honey, your mama in there alone." Annie didn't answer. Her silence was answer enough. Grant nodded once. That's what I thought. Daniel took a slow breath. Officer Grant. Step back. Grant's smile thinned. Or what? Daniel didn't raise his voice. Or you explain, on record, why you're pressing a 6-year-old for information in front of witnesses. Grant laughed lightly, then tapped his radio as if he might use it. You want to make a scene? Grant asked. Because I can make a scene. I can call child services. I can say these kids were endangered. I can say their mother's unfit if she's sending them out alone at night. Annie's breath hitched. Lila gripped Annie's coat with both hands. Daniel looked at Annie, then at Lila, then back at Grant. His voice went colder, not angry, controlled. You're not going to do that tonight. Grant's eyes narrowed. And why's that? Daniel didn't answer with money. He answered with certainty. Because you already tried to intimidate them at the bakery, Daniel said. And you came to my gate without cause. And now you're doing it here. That's a pattern. Grant's smile didn't move, but something in his eyes hardened. Pattern, he repeated, tasting the word like poison. You've been reading too many legal blogs. Daniel met his gaze. I've been living long enough to recognize a bully wearing a badge. For a second, the street seemed to go quiet. Even the wind felt like it paused to listen. Grant stepped closer, voice dropping so only Daniel could hear. You don't understand this neighborhood, Whitmore. You drive in, buy cake, feel good about yourself, and drive out. His eyes flicked toward Annie. But they don't drive out, they stay. Daniel's voice was low, steady. That's why you think you can do whatever you want. Grant's nostrils flared. He straightened, smile returning for the imaginary audience. Fine, he said brightly. Go inside. But you remember something every time you step into this part of town. You become a headline waiting to happen. And headlines don't care about your intentions. He turned, walking backward toward his cruiser for 2 steps, eyes still on Annie. Then he pointed casually, like a man giving friendly advice. And Annie, he called, next time you need food, you tell me, not strangers. Annie didn't speak. She simply tightened her grip on the cake box as if the cardboard might keep her brave. Grant climbed into his cruiser and pulled away slowly, tires crunching over grit. Daniel waited until the car turned the corner and disappeared. Only then did he exhale. Annie looked up at him, eyes glossy but dry. He's going to be mad, she whispered. Daniel's voice softened. He can be mad. Annie shook her head. Not at you. Daniel understood then, fully, painfully, what she meant. Power didn't punish the wealthy first. It punished the ones who couldn't afford to fight back. Daniel stepped closer to the building door and held it open. Go to your mom, he said gently. Give her the cake. Tell her you're safe. Annie hesitated for only a heartbeat, then pulled Lila inside. Before the door shut, Annie looked back at Daniel. Are you leaving now? She asked, the question too old for her face. Daniel didn't promise forever. He promised the next right thing. I'm not leaving until I know you're okay, he said. Annie nodded once, as if filing that promise away like a precious object she didn't fully trust yet. The door closed. Daniel stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to footsteps climbing stairs, to a mother's muffled voice catching on relief, to the quiet sound of a cake box being set on a table. Then he turned back toward the street, toward where Grant's cruiser had gone. A man like that didn't knock once and disappear. He circled, and Daniel Whitmore, for the first time in years, felt the old diner memory rise again, not the hunger, but the humiliation of being told you didn't matter. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to his assistant's contact, then stopped. Some calls you didn't make in public. Some calls you made because you were finally ready to stop looking away. Daniel didn't go inside the building. He stood at the curb with the cold working its way through his coat, staring down Madison Street, as if the darkness might hand him an answer. The patrol cruiser was gone, but Daniel had lived long enough to know the difference between gone and finished. Behind the second-floor window, a light flicked on, then dimmed. A shadow moved past the blinds. He pictured Annie setting the cake box on that small table with the careful seriousness of a child who understood how fragile good things were. He waited for the door to open again. It didn't. That was good. It meant the mother, whatever her name was, had pulled her children into the only safety she could control, a locked door and a quiet room. Daniel respected that instinct. It was the same one his mother had carried. His phone buzzed again. This time it was his assistant, Marlene. A single text, no question marks, all restraint. Board wants you on in 20. Media inquiry from Channel 7. Please advise. Daniel stared at the screen and felt the old tug of habit: protect the company first, always. He could almost hear the board's voice. Optics, risk, liability. He could almost see the spreadsheets that measured damage in percentages, as if human fear could be quantified. He typed back one sentence. Not tonight. I'll call when I can. Then he slid the phone into his pocket and made a different call. It rang twice. Whitmore, a woman answered. Voice clipped and familiar. Rita Sloan, his counsel. Not just a corporate attorney, his attorney. The one who could read a room's intentions before anyone raised their voice. Rita, Daniel said quietly. I need 10 minutes. A pause. Daniel, it's after 7. The board is... I know, he interrupted, not unkindly. This isn't about the board. Silence shifted on the line. Rita knew his tone. She heard the difference between impatience and gravity. Where are you? She asked. Madison Street, Daniel said. South Side. Another pause. Shorter this time. Why? There are 2 children, Daniel replied. A 6-year-old named Annie and her little sister. Annie tried to buy bread with $2. A police officer pressured her in public, and then followed me to my home and now to her building. Rita didn't respond with emotion. She responded with questions. Officer name? Caleb Grant, Daniel said. Rita exhaled once, sharp. Grant. Badge? I didn't see the number, Daniel admitted. But I can. Do not approach him, Rita said immediately. Do not argue. Do not escalate. Do not touch him. I didn't touch him, Daniel replied. I'm telling you now so you don't later, she said. Voice firm. What exactly did he do? Daniel gave it to her clean. Bakery first, insinuations, the gate visit, then the street confrontation. He repeated phrases as best as he could. He described Grant's smile, the threat of calling child services, the subtle way the man aimed power at children, not adults. Rita listened without interrupting. When Daniel finished, she said, You have witnesses? Yes, Daniel answered. Neighbors, the cashier, people in the bakery. Names? Daniel's mind moved through the moment like a slow camera pan. The cashier's face, the veteran cap, the young mother. I don't have names yet, he admitted, but I can get them. Rita's tone hardened. No, not tonight. You don't wander around asking people to identify themselves in this neighborhood while a patrol unit is circling. Daniel's jaw tightened. Then what do? We make this paperwork, Rita replied. We make a trail that doesn't depend on anyone's courage in the moment. Daniel looked toward the building again. He threatened to call child services. That's the play, Rita said. He uses the system as a weapon. He'll frame it as concern. He'll frame you as interference. Daniel didn't like how accurate she sounded. Rita, he said. They're kids. I know, she replied, softer, but only for a beat. That's why we don't let your anger write his ending. Daniel heard the echo of those words in his own head: control, procedure, restraint, things he'd built a fortune on. Rita continued. First, you document what happened at the bakery. Time, location, the exact words you remember. You write it down now while it's fresh. I can do that, Daniel said. Second, Rita said, you do not contact Grant's department directly tonight. You contact internal affairs and you request a supervisor call back. On record. Daniel's gaze sharpened. That fast? Yes, Rita replied. Because the first report becomes the story. If he files first, you are defending yourself from his narrative. If you file first, you're reporting behavior. Daniel felt the weight of that. Paper didn't just record truth. It decided whose truth survived. Third, Rita added, you do not leave those children without knowing the mother's name and condition. But you do that respectfully. You don't go up there like a savior. You ask, once, if she needs medical attention and if she's willing to let you call a doctor. Daniel's throat tightened. She didn't want attention. She doesn't want the wrong attention, Rita corrected. There's a difference. Daniel nodded slowly, even though Rita couldn't see it. Rita's voice remained steady. Do you have security footage from your gate? Yes. Preserve it, she ordered. Right now. Tell your home security company to lock it, export it, back it up. Daniel's mind flicked to Claire inside the house. Flour on her sweater, looking confused and frightened at the idea that a police officer could feel like danger. My daughter saw him, Daniel said. Rita's tone sharpened again. Then your daughter is a witness. You write that down too. Daniel closed his eyes for a second. The world was upside down when an 8-year-old became evidence, Rita finished. And Daniel, listen carefully. This is Chicago. You do not win this by being the richest man in the room. You win it by being the quietest man with the most accurate paper. Daniel exhaled once, controlled. What about the kids tonight? Rita paused, then said, You do nothing that looks like custody. You do nothing that looks like you're taking them anywhere. If you step wrong, he'll claim you were luring them. You stay clean. Daniel looked at the building again, the weak light behind the blinds. So, I leave. You stay available, Rita corrected. You stay reachable. You stay documented. And if he shows up again, you record audio if you can, without putting a phone in his face. Calm, hands visible, always. Daniel's jaw flexed. Understood. Rita's voice dropped slightly. One more thing. Why did he target them? Why does a patrol officer care about 2 kids buying bread? Daniel stared at the street, feeling the cold and the old memory of the diner. Because they're easy, he said. And because he can. Rita was quiet for a beat. Then, call internal affairs. Then call me back with the mother's name and address. And Daniel, don't be heroic. Daniel almost smiled, but there was no humor in it. I'm trying to be correct. That's better, Rita said. Be correct. The call ended. Daniel stood still for a moment, letting the instructions settle like a set of rules he could hold on to. He took out his phone again and opened a notes app. He typed, Whitman Bakery, 5:42 p.m. Child asked for bread. Officer Grant. And then he paused, because he couldn't write. He threatened, without remembering the way Annie's body had tightened, the way she'd whispered he's lying like she'd said it before. Paper had a weight. It wasn't just ink. It was protection if you used it fast enough. Daniel pocketed the phone and looked once more at the building. He wouldn't go upstairs uninvited. He wouldn't knock and turn this into a scene. But he also wouldn't disappear. He took one step back from the door, found a spot where the streetlight reached, and waited, visible, calm, present. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you could do for a child was let them see you didn't vanish the moment trouble showed up. The night stayed too quiet for too long. Daniel remained under the streetlight, hands in his coat pockets, shoulders relaxed on purpose. Cars passed occasionally, their headlights sweeping over the brick facade and the dented metal door like indifferent searchlights. Somewhere above him, a television played faintly through thin walls. A baby cried once, then stopped. Life continued, but it did so cautiously, the way it does in neighborhoods where the wrong attention can be dangerous. He didn't look at his phone again until he heard the building door open. A soft scrape, a hesitant step. Annie appeared first, peeking out like she was checking whether the world was still safe to enter. She spotted Daniel immediately and froze for half a second, surprised he was still there. Then she walked down the steps quickly, pulling the door shut behind her. Daniel straightened, not suddenly, carefully. Hey, he said softly. Annie clutched something in her hand, a folded piece of paper. Her fingers were trembling so slightly it would have been easy to miss if you weren't watching for it. My mom said, she said to give you this, Annie whispered. Daniel didn't reach for it right away. What is it? He asked. It's the hospital paper, Annie said, like the words tasted wrong. She said, you should see. Daniel nodded once and held out his hand slowly. Annie placed the folded paper into his palm as if it were hot. He opened it under the streetlight. A discharge summary. Not much detail, mostly billing codes and brief notes, but one line stood out like a bruise. Left against medical advice. Follow-up recommended. Symptoms persistent. Daniel felt his jaw tighten. How long ago? He asked gently. Today, Annie said. She came home before I got out of school. Daniel's gaze lifted. She shouldn't be home if she needed discharge papers today. Annie looked down at her shoes. She said it cost too much. Daniel closed his eyes for 1 second, forcing the anger into something usable. Is she breathing okay right now? He asked. Annie hesitated. She coughs a lot. Does she have a fever? Annie nodded. And you still went out for bread. Annie's voice cracked, just slightly. Lila was hungry. Daniel understood. He didn't excuse it. He understood it. Can I speak to your mom? He asked. Annie looked back toward the building as if the walls had ears. Then she nodded once. But don't say his name. Officer Grant? Annie's eyes widened. She didn't answer. That was answer enough. Daniel kept his voice low. I won't say anything that makes it worse. I promise. Annie swallowed hard. Promising doesn't always... She stopped herself. Daniel didn't force her to finish the sentence. He let the unfinished truth hang there with respect. They went inside. The hallway was dim. The stairwell smelled like damp carpet and boiled cabbage. Annie moved quickly, as if speed could keep them out of sight. Daniel followed with measured steps, careful not to look like a man on a mission. In places like this, urgency could be misread as threat. At apartment 2B, Annie knocked twice, soft. The door opened immediately, like her mother had been standing behind it. She was younger than Daniel had expected, early 30s, but exhaustion had carved shadows under her eyes that belonged to someone older. A thin blanket was wrapped around her shoulders even though the apartment wasn't cold. Her skin looked too pale against the dim light. When she spoke, her voice carried a rasp. Mr. Whitmore, she said. Daniel nodded. Ma'am. Her eyes flicked past him into the hallway, then back. Always checking. Always listening. Annie slipped inside and immediately moved toward the couch where Lila sat, curled up, quiet, clutching the cake box like it was a bedtime story. Daniel remained at the threshold, not entering fully. Thank you for bringing them back, the mother said. Daniel kept his tone steady. I'm glad they're home. I need to ask you something, and you can say no. Her shoulders tightened. Okay, your discharge paper says you left the hospital today, Daniel said. Are you in danger tonight? She stared at him, eyes narrowing not with hostility, with calculation. Danger? She repeated carefully. Daniel didn't push for confessions. He asked a simpler question. Do you need an ambulance? A shadow crossed her face. Not fear of medical care. Fear of what medical care would invite. No, she said too fast. Then she coughed deep, wet. The kind of cough that stole air. She turned away and pressed her fist against her mouth, shoulders shaking. When she looked back up, her eyes were watery with pain. Daniel didn't soften into pity. He stayed solid. My attorney can arrange a doctor to come here, he said quietly. No sirens, no hospital, a private visit. The mother's mouth tightened. Why would you do that? Daniel's mind flashed back to the diner, his empty stomach, his pride, the humiliation of being denied something as basic as soup. The memory didn't make him sentimental. It made him clear. Because this is what money should be for, he said simply. She studied him for a long moment. You don't know us, she said, and you don't know what you stepped into. Daniel nodded once. That may be true. Her voice dropped. He came by earlier. Daniel's spine went tight. Grant. She flinched at the name anyway, as if even hearing it out loud invited him closer. He came, she repeated, swallowing. He asked questions. He said Annie shouldn't be out alone. Like I didn't know that. Like I chose that. Annie stood very still near the kitchen counter, listening without looking like she was listening. Daniel kept his voice low. Did he threaten you? The mother's eyes flicked to Annie, then to Lila. Her answer came in the only way she could manage safely. He reminded me, she said slowly. What happens when people make trouble for the department? Daniel understood that language. It meant pressure. It meant subtle threats that never sounded like threats if you tried to report them. What's your name? Daniel asked gently. She hesitated. Then, Monique. Monique, Daniel repeated, anchoring her in the air like she mattered. Monique, I'm going to do this correctly. I'm not going to take your kids anywhere. I'm not going to make a scene, but I am going to protect what can be protected. Monique's eyes hardened slightly. Not against him, against the idea of hope. You can't protect us, she said quietly. Not from him. He's local. He's always local. Daniel didn't argue. He didn't promise miracles. He pointed to the discharge paper. You can't breathe right, he said. And Annie is 6 years old counting coins at a bakery. That means you've been alone with this too long. Monique's shoulders slumped a fraction, like the truth weighed more when someone else said it. Annie's voice cut in, small and controlled. Mom, please. The doctor. Monique closed her eyes for a moment, as if steadying herself against pride. Then she nodded once. Okay, she whispered. But no sirens. No police. Daniel nodded. Agreed. He stepped back slightly, still at the threshold. I'm going to make a call from outside, he said. And I'm going to ask Rita to send someone tonight. Monique's gaze sharpened. Rita? My attorney, Daniel said. She'll keep it clean. Monique's mouth tightened, skeptical. Clean doesn't exist here. Daniel didn't dispute that. He only said, then we make it cleaner than it was. He left the apartment and walked down the stairs slowly, not wanting to look like a man fleeing. Outside, the cold hit him again, sharp and honest. He pulled out his phone and dialed Rita. When she answered, he kept his voice low. I have the mother's name, he said. Monique. She left the hospital today. She's sick enough that her kid is buying bread with $2. She says Grant has been reminding her what happens when she makes trouble. Rita's response came immediately. Do not put her on the phone. Do not record her without consent. I'm arranging a private physician, and I'm calling a patient advocate contact I trust. Daniel stared across the street where Grant's cruiser had been parked minutes ago. And Rita, he added quietly. This isn't just about bread anymore. Rita's voice sharpened into certainty. No. Now it's about control. Daniel ended the call and looked back up at the building. In a second-floor window, Annie stood behind the blinds, watching to see if he would disappear. Daniel lifted his hand slightly. A small wave meant only for her. Then he stayed where he was, under the streetlight, waiting for the doctor and for the next move from a man who used a badge like a knife. The doctor arrived in an unmarked sedan. No flashing lights, no siren, no spectacle. Daniel saw the car roll to the curb just after 9. Headlights low, engine quiet. A man stepped out wearing a dark coat and carrying a black medical bag that looked too small to hold the kind of help Monique needed. He approached Daniel first, not the building. Mr. Whitmore? He asked. Daniel nodded. Yes. The man offered a hand. Dr. Evan Price, your counsel called, said discretion mattered. It does, Daniel replied. Dr. Price glanced up at the building, then back to Daniel. What am I walking into? A mother who left the ER today because of cost, Daniel said, and a police officer who seems unusually interested in her children. Dr. Price's mouth tightened. He didn't ask follow-up questions. He didn't need to. In his line of work, you learned the difference between illness and danger. Sometimes they lived in the same room. They went inside together, climbing the stairs in silence. At the second floor, Daniel paused at the door of 2B and knocked gently. Monique opened it immediately, as if she hadn't moved since Daniel left. She was wrapped in the same blanket, her face drawn tighter now, cheeks flushed with fever. Behind her, Annie stood near the kitchen counter, alert, while Lila sat on the couch with her knees tucked up, watching with wide eyes. Monique's gaze flicked to Dr. Price, then to Daniel. This is the doctor, Daniel said softly. No police, no ambulance. Dr. Price offered a small, respectful nod. Miss Monique, I'm Evan. I'm here to evaluate you and help you breathe easier. Monique didn't step back right away. She looked past them into the hallway, as if expecting a uniform to appear behind the doctor's bag. Only after a long beat did she open the door wider. Come in, she said quietly. Dr. Price moved with calm efficiency. He didn't fill the room with authority. He made space. He asked where she'd been treated, when symptoms started, what she'd been given. He spoke in plain language, no condescension, and it helped. Daniel saw Monique's shoulders loosen slightly as the questions stayed medical, not moral. Annie hovered near the counter, hands clasped, eyes fixed on her mother's face. Lila's gaze bounced between the doctor and the cake box like she didn't know which one mattered more. Doctor, Price washed his hands at the sink, pulled gloves from his bag, and checked Monique's temperature and oxygen saturation. His expression didn't change much, but Daniel saw the shift in his eyes when the reading appeared. "Your oxygen is low," Dr. Price said carefully. Monique's mouth tightened. "How low?" "Low enough that I'm concerned," he replied. "And your fever is high. You're working too hard just to breathe." Monique looked toward Annie, then away. "I can't go back," she said. "Doctor." Price didn't argue. He didn't say you must. He said, "Tell me what you're afraid of, and we'll address that." Monique gave a humorless exhale that turned into a cough. When she recovered, she said quietly, "I'm afraid of the bill. I'm afraid of my kids being taken while I'm gone." Annie's chin lifted as if she was ready to defend herself. Dr. Price's voice stayed even. "Those are real fears. But if you stop breathing, those fears become the least of the problem." Monique swallowed hard. Daniel stepped forward slightly, still keeping his body language non-threatening. "Monique," he said softly, "the doctor isn't here to punish you. He's here to keep you alive." Her eyes flashed with something sharp. "Alive isn't the same as safe." The sentence landed in Daniel's chest. Dr. Price turned his attention to Annie. "Sweetheart, can you bring me a glass of water?" he asked gently, not to send her away, but to give her something she could control. Annie nodded quickly and moved. When she turned, the sleeve of her coat lifted. Daniel's gaze caught it, a pale blue plastic band around her wrist. Hospital issue. He hadn't seen it clearly before. Not under the street light. Not in the chaos of Grant's presence. Now he saw the printed black text, and he felt the world tilt. "Jones, Annie, today's date." Dr. Price saw Daniel's face shift. "Something?" he asked quietly. Daniel didn't answer immediately. His mind moved too fast, lining up facts like freight containers. Annie had a hospital band. Monique had discharge papers. Annie was shopping for bread with $2. This wasn't just poverty. This was a system squeezing until it broke. Annie returned with the water and handed it to the doctor, then looked up at Daniel. "What's wrong?" she whispered. Daniel forced his voice into steadiness. "Nothing," he said gently. "I'm thinking." Dr. Price listened to Monique's lungs with his stethoscope, his brow tightening now. "Monique," he said, "I'm hearing congestion that worries me. This could be pneumonia, possibly worse." Monique's face went pale under the flush. "But I can still—" "You're still upright," Dr. Price corrected, kind but firm. "That's not the same as stable." Monique looked toward Annie again, and her expression cracked slightly, not into tears, but into exhaustion. "I can't leave them," she whispered. Daniel spoke quietly. "You won't be leaving them alone." Monique's eyes snapped to him. "I didn't ask you to. I'm not offering custody," Daniel said immediately, choosing his words with precision. "I'm offering presence, and I'm offering legal protection through the proper channels. My attorney is already documenting what happened tonight." Monique's throat worked. She looked like she wanted to refuse on pride alone. Then a cough hit her again. Rougher, deeper. When it ended, she was breathing harder. Annie stepped closer. "Mom, please," she whispered. Lila's voice came smaller from the couch. "Don't go." Monique stared at her younger daughter, then at Annie, then at the doctor. Dr. Price spoke in a tone that was both medical and human. "If we don't treat this properly, you could get worse fast. I can arrange transport without lights. Quiet. Straight to a hospital that will take you." Monique's eyes widened. "A hospital that will take me without turning it into a police event," Dr. Price finished. Yes, Daniel understood what that meant. Quiet entry, discreet admission, people who did their jobs without calling the wrong people. Monique swallowed hard. "And my kids?" Daniel kept his voice steady. "They stay with someone you choose." Monique stared at him for a long moment. Then she shook her head slowly. "There's nobody." The apartment felt smaller. Daniel glanced at Annie's wristband again. He saw the date. He saw the way Annie held herself like she'd been grown for years. He made a decision. "I will not take them anywhere without a written agreement and your consent," he said quietly. "But I can have my housekeeper, Mrs. Hall, come here and sit with them." She's been with my family for 20 years. She's a grandmother. She will not leave them alone. Monique's eyes narrowed, suspicious and desperate at the same time. I don't know her, she whispered. Dr. Price spoke gently. Monique, you can't evaluate perfect trust tonight. You can only choose the safest option you have. Monique's lips trembled once. She pressed them together, fighting it back. Finally, she nodded. Okay, she whispered. Okay, I'll go. Annie's shoulders sagged in relief so sudden it looked like she'd been holding her breath all day. Daniel exhaled slowly. Dr. Price moved immediately, pulling out his phone to coordinate transport. Quiet ambulance, he said into the line. No lights. Patient with respiratory distress. Southside pickup. Monique turned her head toward Annie. Her voice broke just slightly. I'm coming back, she whispered. Annie nodded fast, eyes wet. I'll be good. Monique flinched at that, like the phrase was a knife. She reached for Annie's face and touched her cheek with trembling fingers. You don't have to earn me, she whispered. You hear me? You don't have to earn me. Annie blinked, confused by tenderness that didn't come with conditions. Daniel watched, feeling the anger return quiet, controlled, aimed not at Monique, but at the world that had forced a mother to say those words out loud. Outside, the muffled sound of a vehicle pulling up reached the window. No siren, just the soft arrival of help that had finally been invited without fear. The ambulance that arrived didn't look like the ones people expected. No lights, no siren, no theatrical rush that made neighbors lift blinds and start counting drama like it was currency. It rolled to the curb with the quiet confidence of a service that understood the value of not being noticed. 2 EMTs stepped out, one older man with tired eyes and careful hands, and a woman in her 30s with her hair pulled tight under a knit cap. They moved fast but not loud, carrying a folded stretcher and a medical bag that looked heavier than it should. Dr. Price opened the apartment door before they even knocked. Patient is inside, he said, voice professional. High fever, low O2, likely pneumonia. She left the ER earlier today. The female EMT's eyes sharpened. Left or was discharged? Left, Dr. Price replied. The older EMT muttered under his breath, not unkindly, just weary. Always the same story. Daniel stood slightly to the side, hands visible, not trying to belong in the room more than he already did. He watched Monique pull on her coat with trembling fingers, while Annie tried to help without making it look like help. Lila hovered near the couch, clutching the cake box like it could keep her mother from disappearing. Monique's breathing was rougher now, shallow and quick. She kept swallowing as if swallowing could make fear go away. I don't want them out there, she whispered to Dr. Price, nodding toward the doorway. I don't want. No crowd, Dr. Price said calmly. We'll go out quiet. The female EMT stepped into the apartment and spoke gently, directly to Monique. Hi, I'm Tasha. This is Roy. We're going to get you breathing easier. Okay? Monique nodded, but her eyes were fixed on Annie. Annie stood rigid near the kitchen counter, hospital wristband still bright against her small wrist. She looked like she'd been holding her body together with willpower alone. Monique reached for her, fingers trembling. Annie, look at me. Annie stepped closer. Monique's voice cracked, just once. I'm not leaving you. Annie nodded fast, tears threatening but not falling. I know. Monique shook her head, as if correcting her. No, you don't know. You hope, but I'm telling you. She swallowed hard. I'm coming back. Annie's lips trembled. She whispered, Okay. Daniel watched Monique's face as she forced strength into her voice for her child. It wasn't pride. It wasn't performance. It was survival. Tasha lifted the pulse oximeter again, then looked up at Dr. Price with a small, urgent shake of her head. This is transport now, she said. No more waiting. Roy unfolded the stretcher in the hallway with soft clicks that echoed in the narrow stairwell. Tasha guided Monique toward the door, one hand hovering near her elbow, not grabbing, not controlling, just ready. And that was when the sound arrived. Not a siren, a car door, then another, then boots on pavement below. Daniel's body went still. He stepped toward the window in the stairwell and glanced through the cracked glass. A patrol cruiser had pulled up across the street, Lights off. Engine running. Officer Caleb Grant stepped out slowly, like the night belonged to him. Daniel felt the same chill he'd felt earlier, only now it had teeth. Tasha noticed Daniel's posture change. She followed his gaze and her mouth tightened. "Problem?" she asked quietly. Daniel kept his voice low. "He's back." Monique saw it on Daniel's face before anyone explained. "No," she whispered. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just pure dread. "Not now." Annie's eyes widened. Lila made a small sound near the couch. Half a whimper, half a swallowed sob. "Doctor." Price stepped forward, voice steady. "We keep moving. We don't stop." Tasha nodded once. Roy's jaw tightened. They'd seen this kind of power before, how it showed up at the worst times, and called itself procedure. Monique grabbed Annie's hand, squeezing too hard by accident. "Stay inside," she whispered. "Do not come down. Do you hear me?" Annie nodded quickly, trying to be brave. Monique looked at Lila. "Baby, stay with Annie." Lila nodded, eyes glossy. Tasha guided Monique into the stairwell. Daniel moved ahead of them, not as a hero, as a shield made of calm. He didn't rush. He didn't run. Running would give Grant what he wanted. Chaos. They descended the stairs in controlled steps. Halfway down, Grant's voice floated up from outside, easy and loud enough for anyone with a window to hear. "Well now," he called. "Looks like someone's making a midnight medical run." Daniel stepped out into the cold first. Grant stood at the curb, hands relaxed, smile bright. He looked like a man stopping by to offer assistance. He looked like a man who knew exactly how to perform in public. "Officer," Daniel said evenly. Grant's gaze slid past him to the EMTs behind, then to Monique. His smile warmed, artificial and practiced. "Monique," he said, like he knew her well. "You okay?" Monique's face went rigid. She didn't answer. Grant's eyes flicked to the stretcher. "Ambulance," he said, voice still friendly. "That's serious. You call this in?" Roy didn't engage. EMTs didn't argue with badges on sidewalks. They moved and documented, and tried to keep people breathing. Tasha answered anyway, voice firm. "We have a patient. She needs transport." Grant took one slow step closer. "Did she request transport?" Monique's lips parted, but no sound came out. Daniel understood what was happening. Grant was trying to make her refuse in front of witnesses, to turn medical care into a choice, to make everything look clean on paper. Daniel spoke calmly. "She's going to the hospital." Grant's smile thinned. "Are you her guardian now, Whitmore?" Daniel didn't flinch. "No, I'm a witness." Grant chuckled. "Witnesses everywhere tonight." Tasha stepped forward, voice sharp. "Deputy, officer," Grant corrected smoothly, still smiling. "Officer," Tasha repeated, not backing down. "Step back. You are not medical. You are not stopping transport." Grant's eyes hardened for a fraction. Then the warmth returned. "I'm not stopping anything," he said loudly, for the invisible audience. "I'm ensuring this vulnerable mother isn't being coerced." The word coerced hung in the cold air like a dirty trick. Daniel felt anger rise hot, immediate, but he forced it down into a controlled stillness. "Coerced by who?" Daniel asked. Grant's gaze slid to him. "You tell me." Behind them, a window curtain twitched. Someone was watching. Someone always was. Monique coughed deep, brutal, and her knees wavered. Tasha tightened her stance, steadying her without force. That cough made the performance harder. Grant's smile faltered for half a second. Roy took advantage of the crack. "We're moving," he said firmly, and started guiding the stretcher toward the ambulance. Grant stepped sideways, subtly blocking the path. Daniel didn't touch him. He didn't shove. He did the only move that couldn't be framed as violence. He raised his phone to his ear and dialed, loud enough that Grant could hear the tone, not the words. Grant's eyes narrowed. "Who you calling?" Daniel kept his voice calm. "Internal affairs." Grant's smile snapped back into place, but it went colder. "That's cute." Daniel didn't argue. He spoke into the phone when the line picked up. "This is Daniel Whitmore," he said clearly. "I'm requesting immediate supervisor contact regarding Officer Caleb Grant interfering with medical transport and pressuring a minor's family." Location is Madison Street. Near, Grant's charm cracked. Hang up, he hissed. The first real anger leaking through. Daniel held the phone steady. No. Tasha and Roy moved Monique onto the stretcher quickly. Monique's eyes were wide with fear, fixed on Annie's building like she was trying to memorize it. Grant took another step, hand lifting as if to grab Daniel's phone. Daniel shifted just slightly out of reach, still not jerking, still not giving him a frame. "Do not touch me," Daniel said quietly. Grant froze mid-motion. For a second, he looked like he might push anyway, because power hates being told no. Then he noticed the glow. Across the street, a neighbor's phone screen lit up in the window, pointed downward, recording. Grant saw it. His smile returned for the audience. "Look at that," he said loudly. "The billionaire's making accusations now. Must be nice." Daniel didn't respond. He stayed on the phone. He kept talking in steady sentences while Roy shut the ambulance doors. Monique reached one hand through the closing gap and caught Daniel's wrist lightly. "Don't," she rasped, voice broken and urgent. "Don't make him." Daniel leaned closer so only she could hear. "I'm making it seen," he whispered. Not loud. Seen. The doors latched. The ambulance pulled away without siren. Just the low roll of tires and the blink of a single small running light. Grant stood in the streetlight glow, watching it go, face unreadable now. When Daniel ended the call, he waited until he heard the internal affairs officer confirm a callback and a case intake. Only then did he lower the phone. Grant leaned in slightly, voice soft enough to be private. "You think you're helping," he murmured. "You're not. You're putting a spotlight on people who don't survive spotlights." Daniel met his gaze. "Then stop being the reason they're afraid of light." Grant's smile returned, thin as a blade. "This isn't over," he whispered. Daniel didn't answer with threats. He answered with one sentence, calm and final. "It started." Grant turned and walked back to his cruiser, unhurried, as if he hadn't tried to block an ambulance, as if he hadn't tried to turn a mother's illness into leverage. The cruiser pulled away. Daniel stood alone on the sidewalk, staring at the empty street. Above him, in the second-floor window, Annie's face appeared between the blinds, small and pale. Daniel lifted his hand again, a small wave that said, "I'm still here." Then he looked down at his phone and opened his notes. He typed the last line of the night's entry with steady fingers. 9:12 p.m. Officer Grant arrived during private medical transport. Attempted interference. Recorded. Witnesses present. Paper had weight. And tonight, it was the only kind of armor that wouldn't get a child hurt. Daniel did not go back to his SUV right away. He stood on the sidewalk until the ambulance disappeared, then watched the street for another full minute, forcing his breathing to stay slow. The urge to chase, to push, to force answers out of a system that didn't like questions, that urge lived in his chest like a second heartbeat. He didn't feed it. Upstairs, Annie's face faded from the window. The blinds closed. The building became quiet again, as if it could hide what had just happened. Daniel finally climbed the stairs. He knocked softly on apartment 2B. Not urgent, not demanding. Annie opened the door almost immediately. Her eyes were red, but she was still holding herself together the way children do when they believe adults only have patience for calm. Lila stood behind her, thumb in her mouth again. The cake box now on the table like a fragile anchor. "He came," Annie whispered. Daniel nodded. "I know. Is Mom okay?" "She's on her way to the hospital," Daniel said gently. "A doctor is with her. The EMTs were good." Annie's shoulders sagged with relief that didn't last. "Is he going to take us now?" she asked, voice small. Daniel kept his tone steady. "No one is taking you tonight." Annie didn't look convinced. She stared at his face like she was searching for the edges of the truth. Daniel didn't promise what he couldn't guarantee in court. He promised what he could guarantee in behavior. "I'm going to stay nearby," he said. "And Rita is working on this already." Annie nodded slowly, then whispered the question she'd been holding since the bakery. "Why does he hate us?" Daniel felt the answer rise and stop in his throat. He didn't want to teach her cynicism as fact, but he also refused to lie sweetly. "I don't know if he hates you," Daniel said carefully. "But I know he likes power, and power gets ugly when it's challenged." Annie looked down at her hospital wristband. as if it suddenly felt heavier. "We didn't challenge him," she said. "We just wanted bread." Daniel's voice softened. "Sometimes just surviving feels like a challenge to people who want control." Lila made a small sound on the couch. "Can we go see Mom?" she asked. Annie's eyes lifted, hopeful and terrified at once. Daniel nodded. "Yes, we can." Annie stiffened. "He'll be there." "Maybe," Daniel said. "But the hospital has cameras, staff, rules, and you won't be alone." Annie swallowed. "Mom said don't make it worse." "We won't," Daniel promised. "We're going to do this quietly, correctly." He looked around the apartment again, clean but strained. Not messy, not careless, just stretched thin. A stack of mail on the folding table, a cough drop wrapper on the counter, a blanket that had been used too many nights for too many kinds of comfort. Annie's eyes flicked to the door and back. "We can't leave the building," she whispered. He'll say things." Daniel nodded once, acknowledging the fear without letting it become a decision-maker. "I'll call a ride," he said. "A car service. No flashy SUV, no big story." Annie's gaze sharpened. "Why not your car?" "Because I don't want it to look like I'm taking you," Daniel said plainly. "I want it to look like what it is, kids going to the hospital to be near their mother." Annie didn't fully understand optics, but she understood danger. She nodded. Daniel stepped into the hallway and made 2 calls, one to his driver service, one to Rita. Rita answered on the first ring, voice clipped. "Tell me you didn't touch him." "I didn't," Daniel said. "Ambulance left. Monique is en route. Annie and Lila are still at home. I'm taking them to the hospital now quietly." A short pause. "Good. You do not take them through side entrances. You go through the front. You ask for a patient advocate and a social worker as soon as you arrive. And Daniel, do not let that officer separate those children from hospital staff." Daniel's jaw tightened. "He'll try. Then you make him do it on record," Rita replied. "No arguing in corners. No private conversations. Everything in public. Everything calm." Daniel glanced back at the apartment door. Annie was watching him through the crack like she was afraid he'd vanish mid-sentence. "Understood," he said. The car arrived 5 minutes later, a plain, dark sedan with a small company logo on the rear window. The driver was older, gray hair, polite eyes. He looked like someone's uncle, not someone's muscle. Daniel walked Annie and Lila down the stairs, keeping his pace steady. Annie held Lila's hand tightly. Lila carried the cake box again, the cardboard pressing against her small chest like a shield. At the curb, Daniel opened the rear door for them. "You sit in the middle," he told Annie gently, "so you can hold her." Annie obeyed without question. Daniel got into the front passenger seat. He gave the driver the hospital address and then watched the street through the side mirror as they pulled away. No cruiser followed immediately, but Daniel didn't relax. He'd learned long ago that the absence of pressure didn't mean safety, it meant repositioning. The hospital rose ahead like a block of fluorescent certainty. When they entered the main doors, warm air hit their faces, thick with antiseptic and burnt coffee. The waiting room was half full. A man holding a towel to his hand, an elderly woman wrapped in a coat too thin, a teenage boy staring at the floor like it had answers. The moment Annie and Lila walked in, a few heads turned. Not because the girls were loud, because they were small. Because small children in a hospital at night made people curious, and curiosity could be dangerous. Daniel moved with deliberate calm to the intake desk. The nurse behind the counter looked up, then looked at Daniel, recognition flickering in her eyes. She straightened slightly, guarded but professional. "Can I help you?" she asked. Daniel kept his voice clear. "A woman named Monique was brought in by private medical transport about 15 minutes ago. She has 2 minor children here. We need a patient advocate and social work notified immediately. The children need to stay near their mother and not be separated." The nurse's eyes darted to Annie and Lila, then back to Daniel. "Are you family?" she asked carefully. Daniel didn't pretend. "No. I'm a witness and a support. Their mother can confirm." The nurse hesitated, then picked up the phone. Annie's small fingers tightened around Lila's hand. Lila looked up at Daniel. "Does Mom know we're here?" she whispered. Daniel crouched slightly, not blocking the walkway, just bringing his voice closer to theirs. "She'll be glad," he said. And we're going to do this quietly. Annie's eyes flicked across the waiting room, scanning faces, exits, security. Then she whispered the sentence that made Daniel's skin go cold. He likes hospitals, she said. He comes when she can't talk. Daniel held his expression steady even as something hard formed behind his ribs. The nurse returned and spoke quickly. Social work is on the way. Patient advocate too. Please sit there. Daniel guided the girls to a row of chairs near the wall, away from the center of the room. He sat at the end so he could see the entrance. He didn't sit like a billionaire. He sat like a man waiting for bad weather. And then, the automatic doors opened again. A clean uniform walked in, slow and confident, as if the building belonged to him. Officer Caleb Grant. Annie's body stiffened instantly. Lila's cake box tipped slightly in her lap. Her eyes went wide. Grant's gaze swept the room and landed on them. His smile bloomed like it had been watered. There you are, he said, voice warm enough to fool strangers. Daniel did not stand quickly. He stood slowly, hands visible, posture calm. Grant walked closer, badge gleaming under harsh fluorescent light. Mr. Whitmore, Grant said pleasantly. We keep running into each other. Daniel met his eyes. Officer. Grant looked past him to Annie and Lila, voice softening. Hey girls, you okay? Annie didn't answer. She stared at the floor, shoulders tight, trying to disappear without moving. Grant's smile thinned by a millimeter. Daniel spoke before Grant could press further. A patient advocate and social work have been called. Any questions you have can be addressed with them present. Grant blinked, as if amused. You brought lawyers into a hospital now? I brought rules, Daniel replied evenly. Same thing. When the wrong people ignore them. Grant's smile stayed in place, but his eyes sharpened. Behind the intake desk, the nurse's phone rang again. Somewhere down the hall, footsteps approached quick, purposeful. Daniel didn't look away from Grant. He didn't move toward him. He didn't give him a headline. He simply stood there, calm as a locked door, between a smiling officer and two small girls who had learned too much about fear. Grant stopped 3 feet from Daniel, close enough that his badge caught the fluorescent glare and turned it into a small, sharp star. He kept his smile warm, the kind that worked on strangers who wanted to believe uniforms meant safety. Daniel didn't give him room to make a scene. He kept his hands visible, his shoulders relaxed, his voice flat and calm. A patient advocate and social work are on the way, Daniel repeated. Any conversation involving the children can happen with them present. Grant's smile didn't move. You talk like this is a courtroom. Daniel met his gaze. I talk like this is a hospital. People keep records here. Grant chuckled softly and turned his attention to Annie and Lila like Daniel was a piece of furniture. He dipped slightly at the knees, trying to appear smaller. Hey, sweetheart, he said to Lila, voice gentle. That's a nice box you've got there. Cake? Lila's fingers tightened around the cardboard. She didn't answer. Annie's eyes flicked up for half a second, then down again. Her shoulders pulled inward as if she could shrink into nothing. Grant's smile thinned, barely. You girls came to see your mama? Annie swallowed. She didn't speak. Daniel watched Grant's body language, the way he angled himself to block the girls' view of the entrance. Grant wanted to be the only adult presence they could see. He wanted them to feel alone even in a crowded room. Daniel stepped half a pace not toward Grant, but sideways so Annie could see the intake desk and the door. A simple repositioning, nothing dramatic, Grant noticed. His eyes hardened for a fraction, then his smile returned, brighter. Mr. Whitmore, you're not their guardian. You're not family. You're just involved. Daniel didn't argue with the label. He corrected the intent. I'm a witness. That matters. Grant sighed like a patient teacher. Witness to what? A sick woman going to the hospital? That happens every day. Annie's small voice slipped out before she could stop it. He came when she couldn't talk. The sentence landed in the waiting room like a dropped tray soft. But everyone heard it. Grant's smile froze for half a heartbeat. Daniel's spine tightened, but he kept his face calm. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at Annie steady, not panicked so she wouldn't feel punished for speaking. Grant recovered quickly. He turned his smile into something almost tender and aimed it at the room. Kids say things when they're scared, he said, voice loud enough to sound reasonable. That's why I'm here. To help. Daniel responded without heat. Then help by stepping back. Grant's gaze snapped to Daniel, irritation leaking through the charm. You don't get to order me around in my city. Daniel held the silence for one beat, then said quietly, It isn't your city. It's theirs too. Grant leaned closer, lowering his voice so only Daniel could hear. You keep doing this, and you'll get them hurt. Daniel's tone stayed even. You're the only person threatening anything. Grant's jaw flexed. He straightened and shifted his posture, widening his stance so he looked authoritative. Then he turned back to Annie and Lila. Girls, he said gently, your mom's not in a position to care for you right now. That's just facts. So we need to make sure you have somewhere safe to go tonight. Annie's head snapped up. Her eyes widened with terror. No, she whispered. Grant smiled. No what, honey? No, Annie said again. Stronger, but her voice trembled. I'm staying near her. Grant's smile stayed in place, but it went colder. That's not how it works. Daniel spoke immediately, calm and clear. Hospital policy does not allow law enforcement to remove a child from hospital supervision without documented emergency danger or a court order. Grant blinked at him. You memorized policy? Daniel didn't blink back. I learned what matters. Behind them, the automatic doors opened again, and the air changed with it, not because of drama, but because of purpose. A woman in a gray blazer and hospital badge approached quickly, followed by an older man with a clipboard and a posture that said he had spent years translating conflict into documentation. A security guard trailed behind them, cautious and tired. The woman held her hand up lightly, calm. I'm Angela Henson, hospital social work. What's going on? Daniel kept his tone respectful. Miss Henson, these are Monique's children, Annie and Lila. Their mother arrived by medical transport. Officer Grant is attempting to speak with them about removal from the hospital. Grant cut in smoothly, smiling at Miss Henson. Not removal. Placement. Their mother's unstable. I'm ensuring they're safe. Miss Henson's eyes flicked to Annie and Lila. Annie was gripping Lila's hand hard enough that Lila's knuckles had gone pale. Lila's eyes were glossy with fear. The cake box trembled slightly in her lap. Miss Henson's expression tightened, not emotional, professional. Officer, are you family? Grant didn't hesitate. No. Do you have a court order? Miss Henson asked. Grant's smile held. Not necessary in an emergency. The older man with the clipboard stepped forward. I'm Thomas Jacobs, patient advocate. His voice was firm, measured. We need documentation. Case number. Reason for emergency removal. Grant's eyes narrowed. You're going to challenge law enforcement in front of a lobby full of people? Jacobs didn't blink. I'm going to follow policy in front of a lobby full of people. Grant's smile thinned. Policy doesn't outrank safety. Miss Henson crouched slightly, bringing herself closer to Annie's height. Annie, she said gently, do you feel safe right now? Annie's eyes snapped to Daniel, then back to Miss Henson. Her voice came out small but steady. Not when he's here. Grant's smile twitched, almost breaking. He tried to turn it into softness. Sweetheart, you're just scared because you don't understand. Annie shook her head fast. I understand. He lies. The waiting room quieted further. Even the TV seemed too loud now. Miss Henson rose slowly. Her tone remained polite, but it hardened into procedure. Officer Grant, you will not speak to these children without me present, and you will not remove them from hospital supervision without a verified court order or documented imminent danger. Grant's eyes went cold. I can make your hospital's relationship with the department very uncomfortable. Jacobs lifted his clipboard slightly, like a shield. And we can make every sentence you just said documented. Grant looked around the waiting room. He noticed the eyes, the phones that had come out quietly, the nurse at intake watching with a tight face, the security guard's uneasy posture. He recalculated. Daniel recognized that look. It was the look of a man who didn't lose. He postponed. Grant's smile returned, overly bright. Fine, he said. Keep them. I'll talk to their mother. Miss Henson's eyes sharpened. She is being treated. She may be sedated. You do not have access without clearance. Grant's gaze slid to Daniel. You're enjoying this. Daniel's voice remained level. I'm surviving it. Same as they are. Grant leaned toward Miss Henson, voice low but sharp. You're choosing a billionaire's word over a police officer's concern. Miss Henson held her ground. I'm choosing the children's expressed fear and hospital policy. For a beat, Grant looked like he might argue harder, might push past, might force an angle. Then he smiled again, thin and controlled. All right, he said, stepping back. I'll be back with paperwork. Jacobs nodded once. Bring it. Grant bent toward Annie one last time, voice sugary. Be good, okay? Don't let strangers fill your head. Annie didn't answer. She simply leaned closer to Lila, as if her body could block the sound. Grant straightened and walked toward the exit, slow enough to look calm. He paused at the automatic doors and looked back at Daniel. You can't stay in this neighborhood forever, he said quietly, letting it carry. Daniel held his gaze. Neither can you. If you keep writing threats with your mouth. Grant's smile tightened. Then he turned and left. The waiting room exhaled in small, shaky waves. Ms. Henson moved closer to Annie and Lila immediately, lowering her voice. Sweethearts, I'm going to take you to a private room near ICU so you can be close to your mom. It'll be quieter, safer. Annie's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. Can we see her? Miss Henson softened. We'll ask the nurse. If it's safe, you can stand at the glass. Okay? Annie nodded fast. Jacobs looked at Daniel. Sir, you'll need to stay in public areas. Daniel nodded. I will. Miss Henson guided the girls down the hallway. Lila clutched the cake box the whole way, as if it was the last normal thing in a night that kept turning strange. Annie glanced back once over her shoulder at Daniel. He didn't wave this time. He just stood there. Hands visible, expression steady, letting her see he was still a fixed point in a moving storm, because Grant had said the word paperwork, and Daniel knew, in his bones, that paper could be forged faster than truth could be believed. The ICU corridor was colder than the rest of the hospital. Not just in temperature, but in tone. The lights were brighter and quieter at the same time, as if sound itself had been asked to behave. Nurses moved with practiced economy, shoes soft on the floor, voices clipped and low. A sign on the wall read Quiet Zone in calm blue letters that felt like a plea more than a rule. Miss Henson led Annie and Lila into a small family consult room just off the main hall. 2 chairs, a couch, a box of tissues, and a laminated poster about coping with stress. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee, like every hard conversation that had ever happened behind that door had left residue. Stay here, Miss Henson told them gently. I'm going to check if you can see your mom at the glass. No touching, no going in, just looking. Okay? Annie nodded quickly. Lila's eyes stayed wide as she climbed onto the couch with the cake box still in her lap. Miss Henson paused at the doorway, eyes resting on Annie's wristband. Annie, she said quietly, is that from today? Annie glanced down at her band like she'd forgotten it was there. Yes. Miss Henson didn't ask why. She didn't ask what happened. She simply nodded once and left, pulling the door mostly closed behind her open enough that the girls wouldn't feel trapped, closed enough to keep the hallway from swallowing them. Annie sat on the edge of the chair like she didn't trust the softness. She kept her hands in her lap, fingers intertwined so tightly her knuckles blanched. Lila leaned against the couch arm, half cradling the cake box. After a minute, Lila whispered, Is Mom mad? Annie shook her head fast. No. Mom never gets mad about that. That? Lila asked. Annie hesitated. In her silence lived 1,000 adult problems. About being hungry, Annie said finally. Lila looked down at the cake box. I didn't want cake. I wanted her to eat. The words hit Annie like a punch. Her eyes filled instantly, but she didn't cry. She swallowed hard, the way kids do when they think tears are a luxury. I know, Annie whispered. Me too. The door opened again. Miss Henson stepped inside, face controlled. Okay, she said softly. You can have 2 minutes at the glass. She's sedated. She's on oxygen support. But sometimes people hear more than we think. Annie stood so fast the chair scraped. Lila slid off the couch, cake box clutched tight. They followed Miss Henson down the hall. Steps small, quick, quiet. Annie's eyes searched every corner, every open doorway, every nurse station, as if expecting Grant to appear like a shadow that owned the building. He didn't. Not here. Not yet. They stopped at a window set into a door-thick glass, a narrow panel into a room that felt like another world. Monique lay inside under white sheets. Her face looked smaller without the fever flush, pale against the pillow. A clear tube ran beneath her nose. A machine hummed softly. On her forearm, a bruise darkened against hospital white, an ugly bloom that didn't belong in a place meant for healing. Annie's breath caught. Lila's hands trembled so hard the cake box shifted. She set it on the floor carefully, as if the sound of cardboard might disturb her mother. Annie leaned close to the glass but didn't touch it, not because she didn't want to, because she was afraid wanting would be punished. "Mom," Annie whispered. No response. Only the steady sound of air moving where her mother couldn't do it alone. Lila stepped forward, voice small and cracking. "Hi, Mommy." Annie swallowed hard and tried again. "I got bread," she said, and the sentence came out like confession and pride tangled together. "I got it. I did." Her voice broke on the last word. Ms. Henson knelt behind them, close but not crowding, letting the moment belong to the girls. Lila whispered, "Please wake up." The machine answered with rhythm, not comfort. Annie stared at her mother's face as if memorizing it in case it got taken away. Then her eyes dropped to the bruise on Monique's arm. A picture flashed through Annie's mind, Grant's smile, his words, the way Monique's shoulders went tight at his presence. Annie's fingers curled into fists at her sides. She leaned even closer to the glass and whispered, "I'm here. I'm not leaving." 2 minutes passed like 10 seconds. Miss Henson touched Annie's shoulder gently. "Okay, sweetheart," she murmured. "We have to let the nurses work." Annie stepped back like it hurt physically. She took one last look at Monique's face, then turned away quickly, not wanting anyone to see her expression crack. Back in the consult room, Annie sank onto the couch beside Lila. Lila pulled her knees up and hugged the cake box again, like she needed to hold something that didn't breathe through a machine. Miss Henson sat across from them, notebook in hand. "Annie," she said softly, "I need to ask you a few questions. You can say, 'I don't know.' You can ask me to stop. Okay?" Annie's eyes flicked to the door, then back to Miss Henson. "Is he coming?" Miss Henson didn't pretend she didn't know who he meant. "He's not allowed back here right now," she said calmly. "Security knows, staff knows, and I'm right outside this room if you need me." Annie nodded, but her body stayed tight. Miss Henson began gently. "When your mom got sick today, who took her to the hospital?" Annie swallowed. "I did." Miss Henson's pen paused. "You?" Annie nodded. "I walked her. She held the wall. We went slow." Miss Henson's throat worked once, but she stayed professional. "And when you were at the bakery, why were you alone?" Annie's mouth tightened. "Mom told me not to go, but Lila was hungry, and Mom was sleeping and coughing, and the bread was almost gone." Miss Henson nodded slowly. "Okay," she asked, steady. "Do you know Officer Grant?" Annie's whole body stiffened. Lila pulled the cake box closer. Annie whispered, "Yes. How do you know him?" Annie stared down at her hospital wristband and spoke as if reading from a script she'd memorized for survival. "He comes around. He asks questions. He says he's helping." "Miss." Henson's voice stayed calm. "Has he ever hurt you?" Annie didn't answer for a long moment. Then she whispered, "Not with his hands." Miss Henson's pen moved carefully. "What do you mean?" Annie's voice went thinner. "He says things that make Mom quiet. He says if we make trouble, we'll lose each other." Lila's eyes filled. "He said, Mom would forget us." Miss Henson's face tightened, but her tone remained steady. "Thank you for telling me." Annie's chin wobbled. She fought it back. "He told people Mr. Whitmore was bad." Miss Henson nodded. "I heard him trying to shape a story." "Yes." Annie lifted her eyes finally, looking at Miss Henson with a kind of exhausted courage. "He's going to bring papers," she whispered. "He always brings papers." Miss Henson held Annie's gaze. "Then we will verify them." Annie's lips trembled. "Papers can say anything." Miss Henson's voice softened but didn't weaken. "Not the right papers. Not from the right judge. And not when people are watching." Outside the consult room, footsteps moved down the ICU corridor, measured. Purposeful. Not nurses. Not family. Miss Henson's eyes flicked to the door. She stood quietly, went to the crack, and listened for a beat. Then she returned, face controlled but alert. "Stay here," she told the girls softly. "Do not open the door for anyone except me." "Okay?" Annie nodded fast. Miss Henson stepped out and pulled the door mostly shut. Annie sat perfectly still, breath shallow, as if moving might invite danger. Lila whispered, "Is he coming?" Annie stared at the door and answered with a truth no child should know. "He comes when everything is quiet," she whispered, "so nobody hears you scream." Annie's hands tightened around the edge of her hospital wristband until it dug into her skin. And in the hallway outside, the quiet zone sign watched over them all, powerless against the kind of noise that never used a siren. Miss Henson closed the consult room door until only a thin crack remained, enough for light to leak in, not enough for the hallway to leak through. Annie sat on the couch with Lila pressed against her side, both of them wrapped in a hospital blanket that smelled like bleach and old warmth. Annie didn't move. She didn't blink much either. Her eyes stayed fixed on the door, as if she could stop it from opening by watching hard enough. In the hallway, voices stayed low, but the tone had changed, less routine, more careful. The sound of a clipboard being set down, shoes pausing, a radio crackle quickly silenced. Someone was deciding how to manage a problem without letting it become a headline. Lila whispered, "I'm scared." Annie tightened her arm around her. "Me too," she whispered back. Then, as if remembering she was supposed to be the strong one, she added, "Don't cry loud." Lila pressed her face into Annie's sleeve. The door opened wider. Miss Henson stepped in first, then Supervisor Reynolds behind her dark scrubs, badge clipped high, posture like she'd been awake for 2 days. Patient Advocate Jacobs followed with his clipboard tucked against his chest like armor. A security guard lingered near the door, not aggressive, just alert. Miss Henson spoke softly, "You're safe. We're just going to talk for a minute." Annie nodded once, but her fingers dug into the blanket. Reynolds glanced at the girls and then at Miss Henson. Voice low, "He's here." Annie flinched so hard Lila jerked too. Miss Henson crouched. "He's not coming in here," she said firmly. "Not without us. Not without a verified order." Annie's lips trembled. "He said he would bring papers." Jacob's eyes narrowed. "He said that?" Annie nodded fast. Reynolds exhaled sharply through her nose. "He's already waving them." Annie's face drained of color. Miss Henson kept her voice calm. "Okay, then we do what we do. We verify. We document. We don't let fear make the decision." Lila whispered, "Can we see Mom again?" Miss Henson's gaze softened. "Soon, I promise." 2 minutes at the glass again later, Reynolds didn't soften, but she didn't harden either. She looked at the girls as if she was seeing them as people, not liability. For the first time tonight, Jacobs cleared his throat. "Annie, Lila, if anyone asks you to go somewhere without Miss Henson, you say no. If they try, you yell. You understand?" Annie nodded, but her eyes flicked to the door with doubt. "Yelling doesn't help." Jacobs's mouth tightened. "It helps us document." That answer was honest in a way that hurt. Miss Henson stood and turned to Reynolds. "Where is he?" "Lobby," Reynolds replied. "And he brought a friend." Daniel heard it before he saw it, his own name, murmured in the hall like a piece of the puzzle being dragged into place. He stepped into view at the consult room doorway, staying just outside, visible but not looming. He'd been kept in public areas as instructed. He'd obeyed, but he'd also stayed close enough that the children didn't feel abandoned. Reynolds' eyes flicked to him. "Sir, you can't." Daniel raised his hand slightly. "I'm not coming in. I'm here to hear, not to interfere." Miss Henson glanced at him and nodded once, deciding quickly. "Stay there. Quiet. Daniel held his place at the threshold. Reynolds looked at Miss Henson and Jacobs. He says he has an emergency temporary custody order. Jacobs' grip tightened on his clipboard. From whom? Reynolds swallowed. He says a judge. He won't give details in the lobby. He wants privacy. Miss Henson's voice sharpened. No, not private. If he's going to remove children, it's not private. Annie whispered. He likes hallways. Miss Henson turned back to Annie, then looked at Reynolds. We go as a group. We keep it in a public space. We keep the kids here. Door open. Security posted. Reynolds nodded to the guard. Stand right here. No one enters without Miss Henson. The guard nodded once, face serious now. Jacobs flipped a page on his clipboard. I'm documenting everything from this moment. Timestamp. Names. Words. Reynolds looked at Daniel. You stay in the public corridor. No approaching him. Daniel nodded. Understood. Miss Henson crouched again in front of Annie. We're going to step into the hallway. You stay with Lila. You do not open the door. If anyone other than that guard or me speaks to you, you answer one thing. I want Miss Henson. Okay? Annie nodded hard, eyes wet. Miss Henson rose. We'll be right outside. They stepped out into the ICU corridor, leaving the door cracked, guard posted like a quiet wall. The hallway felt tighter now, as if the hospital itself sensed the approaching collision. They moved toward the lobby in measured steps, Reynolds in front, Jacobs beside her, Miss Henson half a step behind. Daniel followed at a respectful distance, hands visible, voice unused. When they reached the waiting area, the atmosphere had shifted. More eyes, more stillness. A few people pretending not to watch while watching anyway, and there he was. Officer Caleb Grant stood near the intake desk, posture relaxed, smile in place. Beside him stood a man in a blazer with a county badge clipped to his belt. Administration. Not medical. The kind of person whose job was to make problems disappear, not solve them. Grant's smile widened when he saw the group approach. There we go, he said brightly. Now we're all together. Reynolds didn't return the friendliness. Show the order. Grant lifted a folder like a magician, revealing the trick. Emergency temporary custody, he said. These children are being placed in protective care pending investigation. Jacobs's voice stayed even. Investigation of what? Grant's smile never wavered. Endangerment. Neglect. A sick mother. Kids roaming around with strangers. It's all very sad. Daniel felt the anger rise, but he kept his face calm. He had learned the difference between anger that helps and anger that becomes evidence against you. Miss Henson stepped forward, voice firm. I need to see the judge's name and confirmation number. Grant held the paper out, but angled it so she couldn't easily read it. Come on, he said, voice mild. You're stalling. These kids need stability. Jacob stepped closer, not touching the paper, but claiming space. We are verifying. That is not stalling. That is policy. Grant's eyes hardened. Policy doesn't stop me from removing them. Reynolds' voice turned cold. It does here. Grant's smile thinned. Then you're refusing a court order. Reynolds didn't blink. I'm verifying a court order. The man in the blazer finally spoke, voice anxious. Supervisor, we have a lobby full of people. We have liability. We have complaints already. We need this quiet. Grant nodded sympathetically at him. Exactly. I can make it quiet. I take the kids. The billionaire leaves. The hospital stops trending. Daniel felt his stomach twist. Trading children for silence, dressed up as management. Miss Henson's voice sharpened. Those are human beings, not noise cancellation. Grant's eyes flicked to her, irritation flashing. Don't get emotional. Jacobs finally got a clear view of the paper. His eyes moved quickly. Then they narrowed. This is not juvenile court, Jacobs said flatly. This is a magistrate's signature. Grant's smile held. A judge is a judge. Miss Henson shook her head. Not for this. Grant leaned in slightly, voice lower, meant to sound like advice. You want the headline to be, Hospital refused to release kids to protective custody? Because that's how it'll be written. With your names. Reynolds swallowed. Daniel saw it, the pressure working. Not fear of Grant. Fear of chaos. Fear of being blamed for whatever came next. Reynolds turned to Jacobs, voice tight. Can we verify this? Jacobs already had his phone out. I'm calling the clerk. Grant smiled. Too comfortable. Go ahead. Daniel noticed that comfort. People bluff when they're cornered. Grant looked like a man who expected the corner to move for him. Jacobs stepped aside, dialing. Reynolds kept her eyes on the paper. Miss Henson's hands were clenched at her sides. Daniel stayed quiet. Then he heard a small sound from down the hall. Not loud. A door opening, a child's sneakers scuffing the floor. Daniel's head snapped slightly, instinctive. Annie. She had slipped out of the consult room, and she was walking toward the lobby, toward the only adult she believed might stop the paper from swallowing her. Miss Henson turned and saw her too, face tightening with alarm. Annie, she called, but kept her voice low, not wanting to pull the whole lobby into panic. Annie didn't run. She didn't scream. She walked fast, blanket dragging at her heels, eyes locked on Daniel. Grant saw her and his smile sharpened. Hey, there she is, he said warmly, stepping forward as if welcoming her. Annie froze when she realized he was closer than she thought. Her body went rigid. Daniel didn't move toward Grant. He moved toward Annie, slow, controlled, and stopped beside her without touching her, placing himself between her and Grant with the smallest shift of position. Grant's smile thinned. Don't interfere. Whitmore. Daniel kept his voice low. She came to the only place she thought was safe. Grant's eyes flashed. Then she's confused. Annie's voice cracked, loud enough for the closest chairs to hear. I'm not confused. You're lying. The room went still. Even the man in the blazer looked like he wanted to dissolve into the floor. Jacob's voice came from the side, phone still at his ear, face pale. Clerk's office says there is no filing under Monique Jones. No emergency custody on record. Reynolds' head snapped toward him. What? Jacobs nodded, tight. No record. Grant's smile flickered just a fraction before he forced it back into place. Then, they haven't updated the system yet. Reynolds' voice turned firm. Then it's not valid here. Grant's tone sharpened. You're going to refuse protective custody because a clerk is slow? Jacob's voice was cold now. We're going to refuse because it's unverified. Grant's eyes narrowed, and for the first time tonight, the friendliness slipped far enough that the hard part showed. He looked at Annie, and his voice went soft, dangerous. Come on, sweetheart, he said. Let's not make this hard. Annie flinched. Daniel stayed steady, not touching, not shouting, just existing as a barrier. Reynolds lifted her chin. Officer Grant, you are not removing these children. Grant stared at her for a long second, then smiled again, thin and controlled. Fine, he said quietly. Keep them. I'll come back with the right paper. He turned, slow, making sure everyone saw his badge as he walked away, making sure everyone felt the promise in his back. Daniel looked down at Annie. Her hands were shaking under the blanket. He didn't promise her forever. He promised the next moment. Come on, he said softly. Back to the room. You did brave. Now we do smart. Annie nodded once, eyes wet, and let Miss Henson guide her away. Behind them, Grant's voice drifted as he reached the door, sweet enough for strangers to believe. This isn't over. And Daniel knew he meant it. The lobby doors slid shut behind Officer Caleb Grant with a quiet mechanical sigh, but the air he left behind did not settle. It thickened. Annie stood in the middle of the waiting room, blanket pooled around her sneakers, eyes fixed on the space where Grant had disappeared. She didn't look relieved. She looked braced. Daniel knelt slightly beside her, not touching her, not crowding her. He left, he said gently. Annie shook her head once. He comes back. Daniel didn't lie. Maybe. Miss Henson stepped closer, her voice calm but firmer now. And when he does, we'll be ready. Annie looked at her, skeptical in a way no 6-year-old should be. Ready doesn't stop him. Miss Henson held her gaze. Tonight it did. Jacobs closed his clipboard with a quiet snap. And now it's documented. Reynolds turned to Daniel. Your presence escalates him. Daniel nodded once. I know. You planning to stay? she asked, not accusing, calculating. Yes, Daniel replied, but not in the lobby. Reynolds studied him for a moment, then nodded. There's a family waiting room down the hall near ICU. It's smaller, less traffic. Daniel understood the subtext. Stay visible, but don't create spectacle. He rose slowly and walked with Annie and Lila back down the corridor. The hospital lights felt harsher now, like they exposed more than they comforted. Inside the smaller waiting room, Annie sat down hard on the couch, the adrenaline finally leaking out of her limbs. Lila climbed up beside her and leaned into her side, cake box wedged between them like a shared heartbeat. Daniel remained standing near the wall, hands in his coat pockets, posture relaxed but alert. For a long minute, no one spoke. Then Lila asked in a whisper, "Did we win?" Annie didn't answer right away. Daniel did. "We held the line," he said quietly. Lila frowned. "Is that winning?" Daniel considered that. "It's how winning starts," he replied. Annie looked at him. "He said he'd come back with the right paper." Daniel met her eyes. "Then we make sure the right people see it." Annie's fingers moved to her wristband again, pressing against the plastic like it was a reminder of something she hadn't meant to show. Daniel noticed. "Why were you at the hospital today?" he asked gently. Annie stiffened, instinctively protective. "It's okay," Daniel said. "You don't have to tell me if you don't want to." Annie's eyes dropped to the floor. "I couldn't breathe," she said quietly. "At school," Daniel's chest tightened. "Why?" Annie hesitated, then said the simplest version. "Because he was there." Daniel's jaw set, but his voice stayed calm. "At school?" Annie nodded. "He came to talk to the principal. He saw me in the hallway." Lila's small voice chimed in. He smiled. Annie swallowed. "Then I couldn't breathe." Daniel understood now. The wristband wasn't from Monique's visit. It was Annie's. Panic attack, shortness of breath, a child's body reacting to a threat no one else could see. "Did anyone ask why you were scared?" Daniel asked. Annie shook her head. "They said maybe asthma." Daniel closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. Asthma. Easier to diagnose lungs than fear. He crouched down so he was level with her. "Annie," he said softly. "What he's doing has a name." She looked up, wary. "It's called intimidation," Daniel said. "And it's wrong." Annie's voice trembled. "He says he's helping." Daniel nodded slowly. "Some people call control help." Annie blinked fast, processing. The door opened gently. Miss Henson stepped inside, closing it behind her. "She's stable," she said quietly. "On oxygen. They're starting IV antibiotics." Annie exhaled so hard it almost sounded like a sob. "Can we see her again?" Lila asked. "Soon," Miss Henson said. "But first, I need to ask something important." Annie straightened. "Has Officer Grant ever come inside your home without a warrant?" Miss Henson asked carefully. Annie's fingers froze on her wristband. "Yes," she whispered. Daniel's entire body went still. "When?" Miss Henson asked. "Last month," Annie said. "He said he was checking." "Checking what?" "If we had enough food," Annie replied. "If Mom was working. If I was taking care of Lila too much." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Did he have papers then?" Miss Henson asked. Annie shook her head. "He said he didn't need them." Silence filled the room. Jacobs would want that sentence. Paper has weight, Daniel thought, but so does testimony. Miss Henson crouched. "Annie, I need you to hear me very clearly. A police officer cannot just walk into your home without permission or a warrant, unless there is immediate danger." Annie's brows knit together. "He said we were the danger." Daniel felt the words like a blow. Miss Henson's voice hardened. "You are not the danger." Annie's lip trembled. Lila looked up at Daniel. "Are we bad?" Daniel swallowed hard and shook his head. "No." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make it dramatic. He made it certain. "No," he repeated. Miss Henson stood slowly. "I'm filing a report with Child Protective Services myself," she said. "Not against your mother. Against the interference." Daniel looked at her. "You can do that?" "Yes," she replied. "Mandated reporter works both ways." Annie looked confused. Daniel explained gently. "It means when someone sees something wrong, they have to say it, even if it's about a badge." Annie's eyes widened slightly. He's going to be mad, she whispered. Daniel nodded once. Probably. The honesty steadied her more than a false comfort would have. The door opened again. Reynolds stepped in, face tight. He's not gone, she said quietly. Annie froze. He's outside, Reynolds continued. On the sidewalk, talking to someone from local news. Daniel's head turned slowly. Of course he was. Shift the narrative. Create doubt. Make it messy. Miss Henson's jaw set. He wants to frame this before morning. Reynolds looked at Daniel. If cameras show up, this becomes bigger than policy. Daniel stood. His movements were controlled, deliberate. Then we don't give them spectacle, he said. Reynolds frowned. You planning to talk? Daniel shook his head. Not yet. He looked at Annie. Do you trust me? He asked gently. Annie hesitated. Then she nodded once. Then we stay inside, he said. We let paper speak first. Outside, through the narrow window at the end of the hallway, flashing lights from a news van reflected faintly against the glass. Grant's silhouette moved under the street lamp, posture relaxed, smile ready. Daniel felt the old memory rise again, the diner, the humiliation, the moment of being small and unheard. But tonight, he wasn't small, and neither were the girls behind him. He looked at Miss Henson and Reynolds. We prepare statements, he said calmly. We secure the hallway footage. We request the judge's office on record by morning. Reynolds nodded slowly. You're not backing down. Daniel met her gaze. I'm not escalating, he corrected. I'm finishing. Behind him, Annie sat straighter. Lila leaned against her. And outside, the cameras began to gather, hungry for a story they did not yet understand. The news van didn't belong on Madison Street at night. Its white panels and rooftop mast looked too clean under the street lamp glow, like a prop dropped into the wrong scene. A cameraman stood near the curb adjusting a tripod while a reporter in a fitted coat practiced a concerned expression that never reached her eyes. Officer Caleb Grant stayed just off to the side, letting the camera catch him as present, not performing. His posture was relaxed, hands visible, chin slightly lifted, an image built for captions. Daniel watched through the narrow hospital window at the end of the ICU hall. He didn't press his face to the glass. He didn't point. He simply observed the way you observe a storm forming, not with fear, with preparation. Behind him, in the family waiting room, Annie sat with Lila, tucked against her. Miss Henson had moved a chair closer to the door, positioned like a human lock. Reynolds had gone back and forth twice, phone in hand, tightening protocols with each lap. Jacobs was on his third page of notes, handwriting smaller now, as if the facts were coming too fast for the paper. Daniel turned from the window and looked at Miss Henson. Do you have hospital counsel on call? Miss Henson nodded. I left a message. They'll call back. Reynolds exhaled sharply. Counsel won't get here before the story hits. Daniel didn't argue. He didn't need to. He knew how news worked. He knew how fast a lie could become a headline, and how slow truth moved when it had to be verified. Lila whispered, Is he telling them we're bad? Annie didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on Daniel's face the way they'd been fixed on bread prices and police smiles and doors that didn't always stay closed. Daniel crouched slightly so he was level with the girls without blocking the room. He's telling them what makes him look like the hero, he said gently. Annie's voice came out thin. He said you were a stranger. I am, Daniel admitted. But being a stranger doesn't make someone dangerous. Annie's fingers tightened on the blanket. He makes people believe him. Daniel nodded once. That's why we don't fight him with shouting. We fight him with paper. Reynolds returned, phone pressed to her ear, face tight. She ended the call and looked at Daniel. Security says Grant asked for access to ICU charge nurse. Miss Henson's jaw set. Denied. Reynolds nodded. For now. He's pushing. He's claiming he has a duty to check on a vulnerable mother and neglected minors. Daniel felt anger flare, hot and immediate, then forced it back down until it became something usable. He's building justification, he said. Jacobs lifted his clipboard. I'm documenting every attempt, time, name, claim. Miss Henson reached into her pocket and pulled out a hospital phone list. I'm calling the ICU charge nurse directly. No side conversations. She stepped into the hallway, spoke quietly. then returned with a controlled exhale. ICU is putting a restricted visitor note on Monique's chart. No law enforcement access without judicial order. Every attempt logged. Annie blinked fast. He can still come. Miss Henson's voice softened but stayed firm. He can try. Trying is different than succeeding. Daniel stood and checked his phone. A message from Rita flashed at the top of the screen. I can be there in 25. Do not engage media. I've contacted an ombudsman and a state-level liaison. Daniel stared at the word liaison and felt a small shift like the first real lever had been found. He typed back, he's outside with local news. He tried fake custody paperwork. Clerk confirmed no filing. Kids are in ICU family room. Monique sedated. Restricted note in place. He hit send and slid the phone back into his pocket. Reynolds watched him. Your attorney's coming. Yes, Daniel replied. Reynolds' mouth tightened. Good, because he's poisoning the lobby. Daniel turned his head. How? Reynolds gestured down the corridor. People in the waiting room are murmuring. Someone's already filming the door. They're saying you're using money to take kids. Lila's face crumpled. We didn't. Daniel held up one hand gently. I know. He looked at Miss Henson. Move them deeper, he said quietly. Not hidden, just less visible. Miss Henson nodded. There's a staff-adjacent family room with a glass panel. Still public hallway access. Less foot traffic. Reynolds hesitated. We can't put civilians in staff areas. Daniel's voice stayed calm. Then we put them where policy allows and pressure can't. Reynolds stared at him for a beat, then nodded once, deciding, I'll authorize the family room by ICU conference wing. It's technically public, just not near the lobby. Miss Henson crouched in front of Annie and Lila again. We're going to walk somewhere quieter. You stay right with me, okay? Annie nodded, then whispered, He's outside. We're inside, Miss Henson replied. That matters. They moved in a small group, Miss Henson leading with Annie and Lila between her and the wall. Reynolds behind them, Jacobs on the side, Daniel last. No rushing, no running. Running made you look guilty. As they passed a nurse station, a man sitting with a baseball cap low lifted his phone slightly, angling it like he wasn't. His eyes followed Annie. Daniel stepped subtly so his body blocked the lens without making contact. He didn't glare. He didn't speak. He simply existed as an obstacle. The man lowered the phone with a muttered curse and looked away. They reached the conference wing family room. It was small, with 2 chairs, a couch, and a window that looked into the hallway rather than out. The door had no lock, but the hallway outside was quieter, less trafficked. Reynolds spoke to a security guard posted at the corner, and the guard nodded once, taking position without drama. When the girls were seated, Miss Henson exhaled softly. Okay, she murmured. Better. Annie's shoulders dropped a fraction. Lila hugged the cake box, eyes heavy now, exhaustion pulling at her like gravity. Daniel stood near the doorframe, keeping himself visible but not central. From the hallway window, he could still see faint reflections of the news van lights bouncing off the hospital glass. Grant was out there, shaping the world's first impression. Reynolds leaned toward Daniel, voice low. He's going to accuse the hospital of obstruction. Daniel nodded. Let him. He can accuse all he wants. The question is whether he can prove. Jacob's pen scratched. He'll try to manufacture proof. Daniel looked at him. Then we make a stronger record. Miss Henson's phone buzzed. She glanced down, then looked up with a quiet tension in her eyes. He's filed something online. Reynolds' face tightened. What? Miss Henson turned the screen slightly so Daniel could see. A social post from a precinct-affiliated page, wording polished, vague, dangerous. It didn't name Daniel. It didn't name Monique. It didn't mention the children's ages. It just suggested a wealthy outsider had interfered with protective services for vulnerable minors. Annie didn't need to read it to feel it. She watched the adults' faces and whispered, He's making us into a story. Daniel swallowed hard, then nodded slowly. Yes, he said. And now we stop being characters in his story. He looked at Reynolds. Request surveillance preservation in writing, he said. Lobby, ICU hall. Every corridor we walked, every door. Reynolds nodded. Already moving. Done. He looked at Miss Henson. Document Annie's statements, he added. Exactly as she said them. No cleanup. Miss Henson nodded. I will. He looked at Jacobs. Get the clerk's denial in writing if possible, he said. Or at least document the name of the clerk in time. Jacobs' eyes narrowed. Already on it. Then Daniel turned to Annie. He lowered himself slightly again, voice gentle. Annie, he said, you did something brave tonight. You spoke truth out loud in a room that wanted you quiet. Annie's eyes filled. It didn't stop him. It slowed him, Daniel replied. And slowing a bully is how you make them accountable. Annie stared at him, trying to believe. In the hallway, footsteps approached, measured, purposeful. Not a nurse's quick pace. Not a security shuffle. A professional stride. Reynolds stepped into view, then paused, listening. Her face changed relief, mixed with urgency. Miss Henson looked up. Who is it? Reynolds answered quietly. Legal. Daniel's phone buzzed at the same moment. Rita, I'm inside. Don't move. I'm coming to you. Daniel didn't smile. He didn't relax, but something in his chest shifted from helpless to ready. The door to the conference wing opened and a woman in a dark blazer walked into the hall with a hospital counsel badge. Behind her, Rita Sloan appeared coat on, eyes sharp, hair slightly wind-tossed from moving fast. She didn't look like someone who played defense. She looked like someone who wrote outcomes. Rita met Daniel's eyes first and gave one short nod. Then she looked past him into the family room at Annie's small face, at Lila clutching the cake box like it was her last proof of kindness. Rita's expression didn't soften into pity. It hardened into purpose. All right, she said quietly. Now we do this the right way, and we do it fast. Rita didn't waste time on greetings. She stepped into the conference wing family room like she belonged there. Eyes scanning the space the way a firefighter scans smoke. Where are the exits? Where's the fuel? Where's the next collapse? Hospital counsel stood just behind her, a woman with a tight bun and tired authority. Reynolds and Jacobs shifted slightly, making room without speaking. Miss Henson rose from her chair, notebook in hand, ready. Annie sat frozen on the couch, blanket bunched at her chin. Lila leaned into her side, arms wrapped around the cake box like it was her last safe object in the world. Rita crouched not too close, not smiling too big, just enough to be human at their height. Hi, Annie, she said softly. Hi, Lila. I'm Rita. I'm Daniel's lawyer. Lila stared at her and whispered, Lawyer like court? Rita nodded once. Yes. Lawyer like paper that makes people stop lying. Annie's eyes flicked up. He lies a lot. Rita's gaze sharpened, but her voice stayed gentle. I know. And he's counting on you being too tired to fight. Annie swallowed. We are tired. Rita didn't argue. Then I'll carry the heavy part. She stood and turned to hospital counsel. I need immediate preservation of all video footage, she said, crisp and clear. Lobby, intake desk, ICU corridor, conference wing, hallway, all access points, and any badge swipe logs related to Monique Jones and her minor children. In writing, tonight. Hospital counsel nodded. We're initiating a legal hold now. Rita turned to Jacobs. I want names. Every staff member who handled Grant's paperwork. Every person he spoke to. Timestamps. Jacobs lifted his clipboard. I've got them. Rita looked at Reynolds. And I want a restricted visitor note that specifically includes Officer Caleb Grant by name. No law enforcement access without judicial order. Reynolds' mouth tightened. ICU already flagged it. Rita didn't relax. Flagged is not the same as locked. Make it explicit. Reynolds nodded once. I'll do it. Daniel watched Rita work and felt the same sensation he'd felt years ago when he'd finally learned the rules of money. Not comfort, power. Rita didn't raise her voice. She simply made decisions that left less room for manipulation. Then she turned to Daniel, voice dropping slightly. He's outside with media. He's trying to build a narrative that you're a predator with resources. Daniel's jaw flexed. I haven't spoken to anyone. Good, Rita replied. You won't. She looked at Miss Henson. I need a statement from Annie with CPS present. Miss Henson nodded. I can call CPS duty. Rita's eyes flicked to Annie and softened just a fraction. Annie, sweetie, she said gently. I'm going to ask you something, and you can say no if you need to. Okay? Annie nodded once, cautious. Would you be willing to tell a CPS worker what you told Miss Henson? Rita asked. About how he comes when your mom can't talk. About the things he's said. Annie's eyes went wide. Fear rose fast. He'll be mad, she whispered. Rita nodded slowly. Yes. But listen, when he's mad, he gets sloppy. And when people like him get sloppy, the truth has room to breathe. Annie's lips trembled. He said papers can take us. Rita's voice stayed steady. Fake papers can scare people. Real papers stop them. Lila whispered. Will Mom wake up? Reynolds answered softly, surprisingly human. Not tonight, sweetheart. But she's stable. The doctors are doing their job. Lila looked down at the cake box. I wanted her to eat. Rita's face tightened. I know. Then she looked at Daniel. That's your why. You don't let them turn it into anything else. A quiet knock sounded at the doorframe. A security guard leaned in, face cautious. Ma'am, Officer Grant is in the lobby asking for you. He says he wants to clear up misunderstandings with counsel present. Rita's expression didn't change. Of course he does. She turned to hospital counsel. He does not get a private meeting, she said. If he wants to speak, he does it on record with hospital counsel, a supervisor, and preferably a state oversight contact. Hospital counsel nodded. Agreed. Rita looked at Daniel. You stay here. Daniel's jaw tightened. If he... Rita cut him off with a look sharp enough to stop instinct. If you go out there, you give him his clip. You stay. Let me be the bad guy. Daniel forced his hands to unclench. Okay. Rita stepped into the hallway with hospital counsel, Reynolds, and Jacobs. Miss Henson remained inside with the girls. Daniel stayed at the threshold, close enough to see, not close enough to intrude. In the hallway, Rita's voice stayed low but carried authority. We do this in the lobby, in public, with cameras, if he wants cameras. No side rooms. They moved. As they walked down the corridor, Daniel heard voices swelling from the waiting room, the restless hum of people who sensed conflict like animals sense thunder. When they reached the lobby, the scene looked staged. A small local reporter stood by the entrance, microphone ready. The cameraman's lens angled toward the intake desk, searching for the right villain. Officer Grant stood in the center, posture open, smile prepared. The moment he saw Rita, his smile widened with relief because Rita was a new frame. A lawyer meant dispute, and disputes were easier to sell than abuse. Miss Sloan, Grant said warmly, loud enough for the camera. Glad you're here. We need to address this before it gets out of hand. Rita didn't smile. She didn't glare. She treated him like paperwork. Officer Grant, she replied calmly. You presented an emergency custody document that the clerk's office confirms has no filing under Monique Jones. Grant's smile didn't move. Systems lag. Rita's voice stayed even. Courts don't lag on emergency removals. That's the point. Grant chuckled lightly for the camera. You and I both know paperwork can take time. Rita nodded as if agreeing with a child. Then you won't mind waiting for verification. Grant's eyes hardened. Children don't have time. Rita turned slightly so the intake desk nurse, the security guard, and the reporter could all hear her clearly. This hospital will not release any minor to law enforcement without a verified court order or documented immediate danger. Grant's smile tightened. So you're refusing protective custody? Rita replied flatly. No. We are refusing fraud. The reporter's eyebrows lifted. The cameraman leaned in slightly, hungry. Grant's charm sharpened. That's an accusation. Rita's gaze didn't waver. It's a statement of fact based on clerk confirmation and your repeated attempts to access a sedated patient's care plan and her children without lawful authority. Grant's smile finally twitched. It was small, but Daniel saw it even from the corridor entrance. A crack. Grant tried to regain control. This is a vulnerable mother. Those kids were found with a stranger. Rita cut him off, calm and lethal. A stranger who called a doctor. A stranger who ensured transport. A stranger who followed hospital policy. Meanwhile, you attempted to block medical care and attempted removal without a valid order. Grant's jaw flexed. Who told you I blocked care? Rita didn't blink. Witnesses, audio, hospital staff. Grant's eyes flicked quick, calculating toward the reporter, toward the camera, toward the exits. He realized this wasn't a friendly negotiation. This was evidence being spoken out loud. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice, but the mic still caught it. You're making this a spectacle, Rita answered. You brought the cameras. The reporter shifted, sensing the story turn. Grant's smile returned, too bright. Fine. I'll get a court order. Rita nodded once. Do. Until then, no contact with the children or the patient. Grant's eyes narrowed. You can't order me. Hospital counsel stepped in, voice firm. We can enforce hospital restrictions. Grant looked at counsel, then back at Rita. He recalculated again, seeing fewer doors open. Then he did what Daniel had expected. He tried to poison the well. He turned slightly toward the camera, voice warm, paternal. You heard her. Lawyers always want to slow down helping kids, but I won't stop doing my job. I'll follow the process. Rita didn't argue on camera. She let him talk. She let him commit to words that could be used later. Then she said one sentence, quiet but clear, aimed at the record. Officer Grant, if you attempt to remove those children again without verified authority, we will treat it as unlawful interference, and we will involve state oversight immediately. Grant's smile held, but his eyes burned. Noted, he said softly. He turned and walked out of the lobby with the same calm swagger, as if he'd just won, as if walking away was mercy. The reporter hesitated, then asked Rita, Do you have proof? Rita answered without giving a soundbite that could endanger the girls. We have documentation. We have staff statements. And we have a mother in ICU who deserves care without intimidation. Then Rita turned away, refusing the camera's hunger. Back in the conference wing, Daniel stood where he'd been told to stand. Hands still, jaw tight. Rita returned with hospital counsel and Reynolds, her pace controlled. He's going to come back, Miss Henson said quietly. Rita nodded. Yes. Annie looked up from the couch, eyes red. With papers. Rita crouched again. Closer now, her voice softer but unbreakable. Then we'll have papers too, she said. Real ones. Daniel watched Annie's face as the word real landed. It didn't erase fear. It gave fear a rival. Rita stood and looked at Daniel. I'm calling a state-level contact, she said quietly. Someone who can move without the local department blocking it. Daniel's pulse slowed slightly. You have that? Rita's eyes narrowed. I didn't become who I am by trusting local bullies to play fair. Outside, the news van's lights still flickered faintly in the window reflection. The story Grant tried to sell was already spreading. But now, for the first time, Daniel felt the truth, gathering its own momentum, not loud, not dramatic, just procedural and relentless. Because in America, for people like Grant, the only thing scarier than a shout was a signature that held. By the time dawn began to press gray light against the hospital windows, no one in the conference wing family room had truly slept. Lila had finally drifted off sometime after 3, her cheek pressed against Annie's shoulder, cake box still clutched in her arms like a relic from a better hour. Annie hadn't slept at all. She sat upright, eyes open, as if rest were a luxury she couldn't afford. Daniel remained near the doorway, coat still on, tie loosened but not removed. He hadn't left the building once. He hadn't taken a call in the hallway where voices could twist. He had stayed visible, calm, patient. Rita worked from a chair near the wall, laptop open, phone charging from a hospital outlet. Her hair had fallen slightly from its precise arrangement, but her posture remained sharp. She had made 3 calls before sunrise, one to a state oversight office, one to a judge she knew from a prior case, and one to a reporter she trusted to verify before publishing. Miss Henson returned just after 6 with an update. She's responding to treatment, she said quietly. Oxygen levels improving. Annie's breath left her in a shaky exhale. Can we see her? Lila murmured, half awake. In a little while, Miss Henson said gently. Reynolds stepped into the room behind her, face tight but steadier than the night before. He hasn't left the area, she said. Annie's shoulders tensed instantly. But, Reynolds continued, he hasn't come back inside. Rita didn't look up from her screen. He's waiting for cover. Daniel folded his arms loosely. Or back up. Rita nodded once. Her phone buzzed. She glanced down, read the message, and for the first time since she'd arrived, a small, satisfied exhale escaped her. He filed something, she said. Annie's head snapped up. Paper? Yes, Rita replied. Real paper. Silence fell hard. Daniel felt it in his chest. And? He asked. Rita closed the laptop slowly and looked directly at Annie before answering. It's a request, she said carefully. Not an order. He petitioned for emergency review this morning, which means he didn't have it last night. Annie blinked. So he lied? She whispered. Rita didn't soften it. Yes. Jacobs, who had arrived early with fresh copies of documentation, nodded. Clerk's office confirmed timestamp. Petition filed at 5:18 a.m. Reynolds let out a low breath. So last night was bluff. Rita corrected gently. Last night was intimidation. Annie's fingers tightened on the blanket. Is that bad for him? She asked. Rita met her eyes. It's serious. Daniel stepped closer but didn't interrupt. Rita continued, her voice measured and strong. I have already submitted a formal complaint to Internal Affairs with attached documentation from the hospital. The attempted removal, the unverified paperwork, the interference with medical transport. Annie's eyes widened slightly. And the news? Daniel asked. Rita's mouth curved not into a smile, but into strategy. The reporter outside? I sent her a copy of the clerk's timestamp and a statement confirming no valid custody order existed at the time of his attempt. Reynolds' eyebrows lifted. You moved fast. Rita's eyes sharpened. So did he. Annie looked from face to face, trying to follow the adult chessboard. Is he in trouble? She whispered. Daniel knelt slightly beside her. He's being watched now, he said gently. And men like him don't like being watched. Annie's voice trembled. He said spotlights hurt people like us. Daniel nodded slowly. They hurt bullies more. Miss Henson stepped forward, softer now. There's something else. Everyone looked at her. CPS assigned a caseworker, she said. Not from his district, from downtown. Rita's chin lifted. Good. Annie's shoulders went tight again. They're taking us? Miss Henson knelt in front of her, steady and direct. No. They're evaluating safety. That includes evaluating him. Annie stared at her, uncertain. Lila sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes. Can we see Mom now? Reynolds checked her watch. ICU says 5 minutes at the glass. Annie stood immediately. This time, when they walked down the corridor, the hospital felt different. Not lighter, but steadier. At the ICU door, Annie pressed closer to the glass than before. Monique still lay beneath white sheets, oxygen tubing in place, but her breathing was less labored. A nurse adjusted a monitor gently. Lila placed her hand flat against the glass, whispering. We're still here. Annie swallowed hard. Mom, she said softly. He lied. The words didn't need volume. They needed witness. Behind them, Daniel stood at a respectful distance. He didn't crowd the moment. He simply watched the girl stand in front of something fragile and choose not to look away. Reynolds' phone buzzed. She stepped aside to answer, voice low. A pause, then another. She turned back toward Rita, expression shifting. Internal Affairs opened a formal inquiry, she said quietly. Immediate review. Rita didn't react outwardly. But Daniel saw it, the confirmation that paper, when handled correctly, carried weight. Annie looked back at the adults. Is he going to lose his badge? She asked. No one rushed to promise. Rita crouched beside her again. Accountability takes time, she said. But last night, you didn't disappear. And that matters. Annie's chin lifted slightly. Lila tugged at her sleeve. Does that mean we're not bad? Daniel felt the ache in his chest again. He stepped closer now, voice steady and certain. You were never bad, he said. The nurse inside the ICU room adjusted Monique's pillow. For the first time since midnight, Monique's eyelids fluttered. Annie gasped. "Mom?" The nurse noticed and leaned down, speaking gently to Monique. Monique's eyes opened, slightly clouded, weak but aware. Through the glass, Annie raised her hand. Monique saw her, and in that thin moment between sedation and waking, Monique's lips moved. Annie pressed closer, straining to read them. She whispered back automatically, as if she already knew the words. "I'm here." Monique's fingers twitched weakly on the sheet. Lila began to cry, not loud, not panicked, just soft relief. Behind them, Daniel closed his eyes for 1 second. He remembered the diner again, the humiliation, the hunger, and he realized something. The most dangerous part of injustice wasn't the hunger. It was the lie that no one would stand with you. Rita stepped back from the glass and looked at Daniel. "This isn't finished," she said quietly. Daniel nodded. "No," he agreed. Outside the hospital, the news van packed up slowly. A revised headline was already being drafted. Not about a wealthy stranger interfering, but about a disputed custody attempt and an internal affairs review. Grant was still out there somewhere, but now he wasn't operating in the dark. Inside the ICU corridor, Annie lowered her hand from the glass and turned toward Daniel. Her voice was small, but steadier than it had been the night before. "Do we get to go home?" Daniel looked at Rita. Rita nodded slightly. "Yes," Daniel said gently. "When the doctors say your mom can breathe on her own, and when the right paper says you stay together." Annie nodded once, absorbing it. Paper had weight, but so did courage. And this time, courage had witnesses. The morning didn't feel victorious. It felt awake, and sometimes that was enough to begin. This story reminds us that injustice rarely arrives with flashing lights. It often comes quietly, wearing a smile and holding paperwork. It teaches us that power without accountability can frighten the vulnerable into silence. But courage does not have to be loud to be strong. Sometimes courage is a child telling the truth in a hospital hallway. Sometimes it is an adult choosing policy over pride. For an audience who has seen how systems can fail, the message is clear. Real justice is not about winning arguments. It is about standing steady long enough for the truth to be seen. And when even one person refuses to look away, fear begins to lose its grip. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.